Tonight we'll listen to 2 timeless folk tales. Settle softly now, and let the road grow quiet around you. In the oldest quarter of a river town where stone steps sloped gently toward dark water, there lived a boy of 12 named Elian, who had a habit of waking before dawn and listening for sounds other people forgot. He lived with his mother, who dyed wool in broad clay vats behind their narrow house, and with his 2 younger sisters, who slept curled together beneath a patched quilt of faded plum and moss-green cloth. His father had gone north 3 years before with a caravan of mule drivers and paper merchants, and no one said he was lost, though no letter had come and no one could say on what road his shoes now wore thin. In the town people had learned the patient art of not closing a door, even when it had stood open a long while. So Elian's mother kept his father's wooden bowl on the shelf, and now and then she polished the iron hook by the back door where his travelling coat had once hung, and that was how absence lived among them. Not loudly, not bitterly, but like an empty chair kept dusted and ready. Their town stood beside a bend in the river Marelle, where barges moved slowly in the warm months and fog pooled low in the cold ones. Houses climbed the hill in worn terraces of pale stone, with clay roofs and crooked chimneys that leaned companionably toward one another, as if they shared the gossip of every season. In spring the street smelled of the rain, onion shoots, and wet cedar planks brought down from the upland forests. In summer the market smelled of apricots, lamp oil, river mud, nettle cord, and bread cooling on open boards. By autumn the sharp, sweet scent of pressed apples drifted from cellar doors. By winter everything smelled faintly of ash, wool, and the iron quiet of cold water. Elian loved all of it, but most of all he loved the hour before the town fully woke. At that time the bakers had only just begun to shape their loaves, the bargemen still moved in half silence, and the pigeons on the church tower had not yet troubled themselves to quarrel. There was room then for subtle sounds. A rope tightening against a ring bolt, a shutter tapping once and stopping, reeds whispering near the quay, a cartwheel settling in the night's coolness. Elian could identify his neighbours by the sounds they made before sunrise. Old Mara from the herb stall cleared her throat twice before lifting her shutters. The cooper on Lantern Lane dragged 1 foot on the cobbles when he went to soak staves. The mason's dog sneezed every morning as if offended by the existence of dust. And there was another sound, one that came with such regularity that Elian at first thought the town itself must be breathing it. The tap of a staff on stone, slow and even, followed by the soft swing of a lantern. That sound belonged to the night watchman. Everyone in town knew of him, though most noticed him only as part of the hour, the way people notice the moon or the weather vane, and do not consider that either one might have a private history. His name was Sava. He was 79 years old, narrow-shouldered, straight-backed, and quiet, with silver hair tied at the nape in a short cord and eyebrows that seemed to have gathered the winter frost of many years. He wore a dark wool coat with horn buttons polished by use, and even in dry weather he carried a lantern with thick horn panes and a staff made from river ash. He walked every night from the harbour steps to the far north gate and back again, passing the dye houses, the old grain yard, the weaver's lane, the bridge over the mill channel, the potter's square, and the row of shuttered warehouses at the edge of town where the road to the uplands used to begin in earnest. People said he'd walked that route since before Elian's mother was born. "Why always the same road?" Elian once asked the baker's wife, who was brushing flour from her sleeves into the morning air. She shrugged. "Because the road is there." But that answer did not please him. To Elian, roads was not just there. Roads remembered feet. Roads held stories the way wool held dye. Some roads fattened with wagons and trade, while others thinned and faded, then sank under moss and nettles until only the oldest farmers or the most wandering goats recalled them. The thought of a man walking the same road for year after year seemed too large to be explained by habit alone. So he began, in the weeks after his 12th birthday, to wake a little earlier still and sit on the back step while the stars dimmed above the roofs. He would wait for the tap of Sava's staff, and when he heard it he would slip quietly around to the lane and watch the old man pass. Sava always kept the same pace, not hurried, not slow. The pace of one who measures by steadiness rather than speed. His lantern glowed amber in the mist, and the light moved across door latches, cart shafts, rain barrels, and sleeping window ledges with such tenderness that ordinary things seemed, for an instant, beautifully important. 3 mornings passed, then 5, then 11. On the 12th, Sava stopped. Elian nearly stumbled into a stack of kindling. The old man turned his head a little, and the lantern light showed a face lined with the patient wear of weather, not stern and not particularly soft either, but attentive. "If you plan to follow someone," he said, "it is kinder to both of you not to catch your heel on every loose stone in the lane." Elian swallowed. "I wasn't following." "No," said Sava, "you were failing to hide." That might have been enough to send another boy home with hot ears and a sharp lesson. But there was no meanness in the words, only truth, and Elian found truth easier to stand near than scolding. "I only wanted to know," he said. "To know what?" "Why you walk that road?" Sava considered him for a moment, and the silence around them held the damp breath of the river. Somewhere behind a wall, a tethered mule stamped once and settled. "Most who ask that question are not interested in the answer," Sava said. "They want only a smaller question to replace a larger one." Elian frowned. "I don't." "No?" "No." "Then come tomorrow," said Sava. "If your mother agrees and if you can keep pace without fidgeting." He turned and continued on, and Elian stood in the lane with his heart fluttering like a moth at lantern glass. His mother listened while he told her, turning skeins of washed wool through a basin of pale blue dye. Steam rose around her wrists. She was a practical woman who believed that much trouble in the world came from people being either careless with tools or careless with time. For a while she said nothing. Then she drew the wool up, let the excess dye drip back into the basin, and hung the skein over a pole. "Ça va?" she said. Elian nodded eagerly. "He watched over the North Quarter when I was little, and before that he worked the old post road with his brother, I think. Or perhaps his cousin. My memory tangles names." She looked at him over the steam. "If you go, you stay where he tells you. You do not wander to the quay by yourself. You do not touch another person's goods. And if you grow tired, you say so before you grow foolish." "I will." She smiled then, a little tiredly, a little fondly. "You've already put your boots by the door, haven't you?" He had. And so the next morning, long before dawn had stirred, Elian wrapped a scarf round his throat and met Sava at the harbour steps, where the river breathed mist across the stone. The watchman carried his usual lantern and staff, but over his shoulder hung a coil of rope, and at his belt was a small leather pouch that clinked softly. "You came," said Sava. "I said I would." "That is not the same thing." Elian thought about that as they began to walk. At first the road was simply the familiar path through the waking town. They passed the fish sheds where nets hung like dark curtains. They went by the dye houses, where the clay vats sat under slatted roofs, and the air still held yesterday's scent of indigo and alderbark. They crossed the little bridge over the mill channel. Water slid beneath them with a steady hush. turning the wheel of the lower mill in its sleep. Cats moved through alley mouths and vanished. From an upper window came the tiny sound of someone knocking ash from a stove grate. Sava greeted no one because no one was yet awake enough to greet him, but now and then he lifted his lantern toward a shutter not fully latched, or paused to set a bucket upright where a sleepy hand had left it rolling in a doorway. Once he stooped to move a basket of onions farther in from the street before the damp could spoil them. At the old grain yard, where storehouses of weathered timber lined a broad square, Sava stopped by a post half swallowed in ivy. Iron rings jutted from it at shoulder height, rusty but stout. "What do you see?" he asked. "A post," said Elian. Sava nodded. "That is what most people see. What else?" Elian stepped closer. The wood was scarred by rope wear. The stone below was polished in a crescent where something heavy had swung against it again and again. "Animals tied here?" "Yes, pack mules mostly, before your time, before some of the storehouses were empty, before grain moved more by river than by road." Sava touched one of the rings. A place can keep doing its work long after people have forgotten the name of the work. He moved on. When they reached the north edge of town, the houses thinned, gardens widened behind low stone walls, a stand of poplars whispered in the damp wind. Beyond the gate the road narrowed and lost its careful paving. Grass grew in the middle, where wheels no longer passed every week. The mist settled deeper here, and the world became a pale grey ribbon edged with hedges, thorn trees, and abandoned mile markers leaning like tired shoulders. Elian stared. He'd gone through the north gate before, but never at this hour and never so far. "I thought the road ended at the warehouses." "Roads rarely end where people stop looking at them," said Sava. The old watchman turned onto the track beyond the gate, and Elian followed, boots whispering through damp grass. Soon the town had sunk behind them. They walked between old orchards gone half wild, their branches silvered with lichen. They passed a collapsed rest shed where only 2 posts and 1 beam remained, all bound in bramble. They crossed a shallow rill by stepping stones green with moss. On the far bank stood a small shrine niche cut into a rock face, empty now except for rainwater and a single feather. "This was once the Lantern Road," said Sava after a while, "though before that it had another name, and before that another still. It led from the river town to the upland weaving villages and farther on to the salt terraces. Cloth went up, salt came down. Also honey, resin, smoked trout, spindlewood, bundles of flax, jars of berry preserve, and sometimes letters if the season was kind. The road was not grand, but it was faithful. Faithful roads feed towns. Why did people stop using it? River barges improved. Then the western market grew larger. Then a flood took the North Bridge in my father's day, and though it was rebuilt, the trade had already shifted. That is how roads fade. Seldom with a single event. More often with a series of small forgettings. Elian walked in silence, imagining the road once busy with mules, peddlers, women carrying cloth wrapped in oilskin, Isolt men with white-crusted boots, children running from gate to glimpse what the caravans had brought. The mist around them made it easy to believe those footsteps were only just ahead. After some time they came to a section where alder roots had broken the stone edging and last year's leaves lay thick in the wheel ruts. Sava set down his lantern, drew a short pruning knife from his belt and began to cut back the brambles. Elian blinked. "We're working?" Sava glanced sideways. "What did you think a walking was?" The answer was so unexpected that Elian laughed quietly, and the sound pleased the morning air. So they worked. At first Elian's hands were clumsy. He pulled nettles without gloves and regretted it. He tugged thorny runners in the wrong direction and caught his sleeve, but Sava showed him how to brace a boot, how to follow a bramble to its thickest stem, how to clear a drain trench with a stick rather than a bare hand, how to tell the difference between useful retaining stones and loose rubble that ought not be touched. They did not hurry. When a patch was cleared, they stood and looked at it as if listening. The road beneath the growth was narrower than Elian had expected, but firmer too. Old flat stones emerged, some cracked, some merely hidden. Water that had puddled in a shallow dip suddenly found its ditch and slipped away with a tiny bright murmur. "There," said Sava, "a road likes to breathe." By the time the eastern sky began to pale, Elian's shoulders ached pleasantly. The air smelled of wet leaves, raw earth, and cut thorn. A thrush started up in the hedge with a questioning note. Sava drew a corked flask from his pouch and handed it to Elian. Warm barley tea, sweetened with a little honey. The boy drank and felt the heat go through him like a second dawn. They sat on a fallen milestone, partly wrapped in moss. On one face, after Sava rubbed it with a cloth, faint carving emerged, 3 shallow lines and a wheel mark. "My brother taught me those signs," Sava said. "You had a brother?" "Still have, depending on whether you ask memory or the world." The old man's voice remained calm, but he looked along the road as he spoke. His name was Terran. He was older by 7 years, broad where I was narrow, cheerful where I was watchful. We walked this road together when we were young, and carried messages for traders too poor to keep a full mule string. Later we helped repair storm damage, checked the way shrines, and relit the guide lanterns in the bad fog months. Elian leaned forward. There were lanterns. At 3 bends and 2 crossings, hooks on posts, horn lanterns with shuttered sides. In thick weather, they were lit from dusk to dawn. Sava gave a small smile. The Lantern Road earned its name honestly once. What happened to them? Hooks rusted, glass broke, oil grew expensive. People stopped asking where the nearest guide light stood, and instead they asked whether anyone remembered an easier road. He rested his hands on the top of his staff. "My brother said a road does not disappear all at once. First its lamps go dark, then its drains choke, then its edges soften. Then only people with reasons continue to walk it." "And you had reasons?" Sava nodded. "Yes." He did not say more, and Elian, sensing the shape of a silence that should be left intact, asked no further question. They returned to town by full morning. Bakers were carrying trays to market. Women shook rugs from upper windows. A coppersmith had set his first kettle outside to catch the light. Elian's sisters were already awake when he came home, and both demanded to know whether he had seen foxes, smugglers, or buried treasure. He said no to the first 2 and perhaps to the third, because he had seen stones return to daylight, and that felt treasure-like in its own right. For the next several weeks, whenever his duties at home allowed, he joined Sava before dawn. Not every morning. His mother had vats to scrub, wool to turn, errands to send. Like some days he chopped kindling or delivered dyed thread to the seamstress on Mill Lane, or watched his sisters while his mother bargained for alum and madder root. But on the days he could go, he went, and the road began to enter him. He learned its moods. After rain, the hollows held the scent of fennel and damp clay. On cold mornings, frost limbed every grass blade and made the old ruts gleam pale as fish scales. In wind, the poplars near the north gate clattered like distant wooden bells. In stillness, he could hear water travelling underground beneath a broken culvert long before it surfaced in the ditch below. He learned the names of forgotten structures. A low mound beside the hedge turned out to be the remains of a charcoal burner's shelter. A square of stone sunk in nettles had once supported a way table, where traders set down loads to ease their shoulders. A row of half-buried posts marked the boundary of an orchard, kept by a widow who had sold dried pears to caravans 40 years before Elian was born. He learned that work on a road was less about force than attention. Clear water first, then edges, then markers, then places for feet to pause without sinking. Sava said this so often that eventually Elian could hear the whole saying in the old man's silence before the words were spoken. He learned too that Sava's pouch held not coins but small practical treasures: a tin of lamp wick, a whetstone, waxed cord, chalk, a folded strip of leather, 2 nails, a stub of beeswax candle, and a tiny brass key whose lock Elian never saw. Once, on a morning of steady drizzle, Sava unhooked from his belt a little oilskin packet and opened it to reveal dry tinder wrapped inside curled birch bark. "You carry all that every night?" Elian asked. "Of course. Even if you don't need it." Sava looked mildly surprised. Most things worth carrying are needed precisely on the nights one did not expect. By midsummer, Elian knew that the old watchman's route through town was not the whole of his watch at all. It was only the visible seam of a larger fabric. After checking the streets and store yards, Sava would walk the lantern road as far as the Broken Willow Bend, clear what needed clearing, note what required mending, and then return before the market bells. On some mornings he went farther, to the old toll arch where no toll had been collected in 30 years. On others he stopped near the first orchard and spent an hour scraping moss from the carved face of a guidepost. But why keep doing it? Elian asked one bright morning as they levered silt from a ditch with flat sticks, if hardly anyone uses the road. Sava did not answer at once. A dragonfly skimmed the water pulled by Elian's boot. Somewhere in the hedge a lark gave a thread of song. "You think use begins only when crowds arrive," he said at last. "But that is market thinking. There are quieter kinds of use. A shepherd taking a lamb to the herb woman in town, a widow walking to her sister's village without wading marsh, a peddler carrying needles and lamp chimneys, a message delivered before weather closes the pass. And there is another use beyond these. What is it? To remember that towns are not only fed by what is profitable this season, they are fed by what was made carefully before them." Elian turned those words over in his mind all day and most of the next. They settled there beside many other things Sava said, as seeds settle in the seams of old walls until one day they begin to grow. The first sign that the lantern road might return to common use came not with a proclamation or a council meeting, but with a donkey. Its owner was a woman from the upland village of Bracken Fold, though Elian did not know that yet. He and Sava had just finished retying a gate on the edge of a neglected orchard, when they heard the animal bray in a tone of deep personal complaint. Around the bend came a grey donkey with panniers, a woman in a russet cloak, and behind her a girl carrying a basket covered in blue cloth. The woman stopped when she saw them. "Does this road still reach the river town?" she asked, as though she suspected it might change its mind. "It does," said Sava. "All the way?" "All the way, one careful step at a time." The woman laughed softly, then blessing on the hands that kept it. She introduced herself as Irina, a cheesemaker from Brackenfold. Heavy rains had muddied the western cart track, and the river ferry on their side had stopped for repairs. She'd not taken the lantern road in years, not since she was young enough to walk it with her aunt, but someone in her village remembered it. Someone else said it would be bramble to the throat, and here she was, surprised to find the path clear enough for the donkey and dry underfoot besides. Her panniers held wax-wrapped rounds of mountain cheese and 2 bundles of sage. The girl behind her, a niece perhaps, carried jars of cloudberry preserve cushioned with straw. Sava asked after the upper crossing and the old plank bridge near the Aldermarsh. Irina answered in practical detail. Elian listened, fascinated. This was the kind of exchange a road existed for. Not merely footsteps, but knowledge moving. When they adjoined, the donkey's ears bobbing in the light, Elian grinned. That counts as use. It does, said Sava. A week later they met a basket maker from Low Fern Hamlet bringing willow cradles and eel traps. The week after that an elderly shepherd with 2 fleeces and a wrapped packet of letters asked whether the north gate still opened before sunrise. Then came 2 sisters carrying woven sashes to market. And later, a miller's nephew with sacks of buckwheat on a mule too self-important to acknowledge anyone. None of these travellers made a procession, but the road had begun to remember itself under their feet. Word moved through town in the way useful things move, first as rumour, then as habit. A cooper said he had purchased pitch from the uplands cheaper by the old route. Mara the herb woman said fresher sage was arriving. The baker's wife claimed a trader from Bracken Fold had delivered honey before noon instead of near dusk. The coppersmith muttered that if pack trains started again, the North Quarter might not feel so abandoned. None of this made the town suddenly busy or prosperous. The warehouses did not fill overnight. The council did not erect banners. Yet a certain posture changed. Made shopkeepers on the north side began to sweep farther into the street. Someone repaired the broken step at the gate. The potter set out more storage jars in case merchants needed them. Small responses. But roads, Elian was learning, lived on small responses. Late one morning, after Elian had spent dawn with Sava and the rest of the day helping his mother rinse wool, a stranger came to their dye yard. He wore a coat of dark green broadcloth better cut than local tailors usually managed, and his boots carried the reddish dust of inland roads. At his belt hung a narrow ledger in a leather case. He bowed politely to Elian's mother and asked whether she knew where one might find the night watchman called Sava Vey. Elian, crouched beside a vat, looked up at once. "What does he want with Sava?" his mother asked. The man smiled as those do who want information without giving any. "Only to speak of roads and trade. That is a larger subject than most afternoon visits can manage," she said. Elian admired her for that. Eventually the stranger was directed to the grain yard, where Sava sometimes rested after his route. Curiosity pressed at Elian like a hand between the shoulder blades, but his mother, who saw such things before they became excuses, sent him with a basket of damp wool to the line and kept him too busy to follow. It was Sava himself who told him of the visit the next morning. "The man is named Darrow Sen," said the old watchman as they walked beyond the north gate. "He buys and contracts for merchants in the Western Market town." What did he want? To know whether the Lantern Road can carry regular pack traffic by autumn. Elian stopped short. Can it? Sava continued a few steps before noticing he was alone and turning back. That depends on whether the road is a thing people merely hope for or a thing they're willing to mend. Elian hurried to catch up. What did you tell him? That I do not answer for roads by myself. This puzzled Elian all morning. Sava said no more, and when an old person means to keep silent, questions slide off them like rain off slate. Still, the words tugged at him. I do not answer for roads by myself. 2 days later the matter grew larger. A notice was posted beside the fountain in Market Square, written in the careful hand of the town clerk, and weighted at the corners by smooth stones. Because Elian had already heard the whisper of it from a cooper's apprentice, he reached the square early, pushing between skirts and aprons and the basketed knees of market wives. The notice declared that representatives from the Western Market and the River Guild wished to assess the condition of the Old North route for seasonal pack use. Any townspeople with interest in the repair of the North Road, its storeyards, culverts and guide points were invited to gather in 3 days' time at the grain yard to discuss labour, tools and the possible relighting of the outer-way lanterns. Elian read it twice, then a third time for the pleasure of seeing the words stay the same. When Sava heard, he merely nodded, as if the town had at last caught up with a thought he had been holding for many years. The gathering was not grand, yet Elian thought later that it had the feel of one of those quiet hinges on which whole seasons turn. Men came with measuring rods and folded papers. Women came with practical questions. The potter's eldest son said he could fire replacement drain tiles if clay were brought. The rope maker offered offcuts for lantern hooks and mule ties. A widow from the North Quarter said she still had her father's iron road spade. The cooper thought 2 water barrels should be set just inside the gate in case traffic returned and animals needed drink. Someone else asked who would pay. Someone else said that if people waited to begin until all money questions were settled, the road would vanish again first. And Darrow Sen attended in his green coat with 2 clerks and a mule driver who tested the packed earth with a sceptical boot. A representative from the River Guild, a broad-faced woman named Hessa, spoke of storage, pacing and weather windows. The town clerk made notes. There was much throat clearing and a fair amount of cautious muttering, but there was no shouting. The matter was too old and too useful for shouting. Sava did not stand at the centre, though many eyes turned to him. He spoke only when asked where the ditches failed first after heavy rain, where retaining stones had slipped, which bends would need widening for loaded animals, and whether the broken lantern hooks at Broken Willow and Toll Arch could be repaired rather than replaced. His answers were exact, not one word extra, not one withheld for drama. Elian, or sitting on an overturned basket near the cooper's stall, watched the clerks write down every syllable. That afternoon, assignments began. The town did not call it that, but that is what it was. Those with carts could haul stone from the lower quarry. Those with shovels would meet in 2 mornings to clear the main side drain beyond the gate. The potter would inspect whether the old water channel pipes near the alder marsh could be remade. 2 women from the weaving lane volunteered to mend oilcloth covers for goods left in the grain yard. Hesse of the guild said that if the first repairs were done within a fortnight, a trial pack string would come before the end of summer. "And what do I do?" Elian asked, breathless with wanting. Sava looked at him. "Or you come tomorrow before dawn with a smaller basket than last time and hands ready for old nails." So Elian came, and the next day, and many after. The restoration of the Lantern Road was not a single enterprise but 100 humble ones stitched together. At the gate they scrubbed lichen from old marker stones, so travellers could judge distance by lantern light. Beyond the first orchard they cut back elder shoots and thorn, stacking usable rods for basketry, and burning the rest in supervised heaps that smelled sharp and green. At the washed-out culvert near the rill crossing, men set flat stone shoulders while children carried fist-sized gravel in aprons and buckets. The potter's son and his sister measured the broken drain tiles, then shaped new ones in the yard behind their kiln. Leaving thumb marks inside the clay that no one would ever see once the pieces were laid. Sava moved among all this with his usual calm, and because he remained calm, others did too. When people asked where to begin, he pointed with his staff. When 2 plans overlapped badly, he found the seam between them. When an overeager mason proposed cutting straight through a hedge line that had stood since before his grandfather's day, Sava said only, "Roads must fit the land as well as travellers," and somehow the hedge remained, trimmed but living. Elian was astonished by how much work lay hidden under the word repair. He had thought of roads as surfaces. Now he understood they were also channels, edges, resting places, memory markers, shade points, tie posts, and habits of approach. They had to shed water, welcome feet, guide in fog, and allow beasts to turn without panic. Even the placement of a bench stone near the old toll arch mattered, because a load-laden traveller with a resting place at the right hour arrived to mark it kinder and in better order than one who had strained too long. One dawn they found Sava kneeling beside an old guidepost, not working but looking. The post leaned a little, iron curled from one side where a lantern hook had once hung. Ivy had entered a crack and widened it. "Can it be saved?" Elian asked softly. Sava laid a palm on the weathered wood. "It should be, if it wishes." Elian smiled at the phrasing. "How do you know if a post wishes it?" "You wait and see whether the soundwood still answers beneath the rot." So they fetched tools. The carpenter from Mill Lane came with chisels and resin. They cut away the worst of the softened timber, or filled the deep seam with a fitted strip of seasoned ash, bound the join with narrow iron bands warmed and bent to size, and set a new hook forged by the blacksmith's wife, who made finer practical iron than her husband, but received less credit for it in public. By the time they were done, the post still looked old, which pleased Sava. A road should not pretend to youth, he said, only to steadiness. The question of lanterns came next. The town had once kept 5 outer guide lanterns along the north route. Only one survived whole, hanging dusty in the store loft above the grain yard beneath broken yokes and a rolled reed mat. Elian helped lower it. Its horn panes were smoke-darkened. One hinge sagged, but the frame held, and the little vent cap at the top was merely stiff, not ruined. Now Sava cleaned it with such care that the act resembled remembrance. He warmed old grease from the hinge with his fingertips, rubbed the horn with linen, and replaced the wick holder with one hammered from sheet brass by the coppersmith. When the lantern was ready, Elian held it up and saw his own warped face in the horn. "Where will it go?" he asked. "Broken Willow Bend," said Sava. "Fog gathers there first. And the others? We remake what we can, borrow light until the road earns more." The next market day, Mara the herb woman contributed dried rosemary to scent the lantern oil and discourage insects. The rope maker offered fine cord to secure the hanging doors. Hesse arranged for a small cask of oil to be set aside from the River Guild's stores. One by one, practical things gathered as they do when people begin to believe a task belongs to them. At home, Elian's world continued too. His sisters squabbled over plum pits and begged him for stories of the road. His mother stained her wrists with walnut husk and marigold, and listened while he described new repairs. At first she smiled only because he was happy. Then, as more upland traders appeared at market, she began to notice change with a dyer's practical eye. "I sold all the russet thread before noon," she said one evening, winding skeins by lamplight. "A woman from Bracken Fold bought enough for winter weaving. She says more may come if the North Road holds." Elian brightened. "See?" "I do see," she said, and there was wonder beneath the caution. "And I also see I must order more alum." That night the house felt less like one that waited and more like one that prepared. Summer leaned slowly toward autumn. Days shortened by a breath at a time. Apples began to weight the boughs in the town gardens. On the road, blackberries darkened among the hedges. The work did not lessen, but it changed. What had been clearing became finishing. What had been rescue became readiness. Then came the trial caravan. It was smaller than the caravans of old stories, larger than the scattered travellers who had begun using the route again. 6-pack mules? 2 donkeys, 3 muleteers, and a mixed string of traders from the uplands and the river quarter. They came in from Bracken Fold and beyond, carrying wrapped bales of coarse mountain cloth, jars of resin sealed with wax, small sacks of salt, and 2 bundles of birch brooms, willow baskets packed inside one another like sleeping birds, dried mushrooms in linen bags, and a chest of carved spindle whorls. Returning with them from town would go dyed thread, copper kettles, lamp glass, needles, paper, and sacks of river grain not grown easily in the uplands. The whole north quarter turned out to watch them arrive at the gate in the gold of early morning. The animals' bells gave a deep, irregular chiming. Leather creaked. Hooves struck the newly cleared stones with the sound that seemed both new and ancient. Darrow Sen stood by with his ledger, trying to look like this was merely a matter of figures balancing. Hesse counted loads. Children craned between adults and whispered at the sight of resin jars and salt sacks white as old bone. Elian stood beside Sava near the guidepost they had repaired. "Well?" Elian asked under his breath. Sava's eyes followed the lead mule as it passed smoothly through the gate. "A road does not praise itself," he said. But the lantern light of satisfaction, though no lantern burned, seemed to touch his face. The traders made use of every repaired feature without knowing half of what had gone into them. They watered the animals from the barrels the cooper had insisted on. They tied lines to the post at the grain yard. They rested loads on the bench stone near the gate. One mule slipped slightly near the mill bridge but recovered because the loose cobble there had been reset the week before. A woman carrying salt asked where the next guide point stood in fog, and when she was told Broken Willow. She nodded as one reassured by an old friend's surviving house. Trade did not transform the town in a day, but it entered like warmth through a door left ajar. The north storeyards reopened one by one. An old warehouse was swept and rented for basket storage. The empty loft above the cooper's shed filled with wool bales awaiting barter. The baker began rising even earlier on market mornings. The seamstress on Mill Lane started sewing sturdier outer sacks for pack goods. There was talk of reopening a second weigh table in the North Square. There was also talk from the council and the guild of appointing seasonal road hands to keep the route clear. All this was good, yet Elian, who by now knew Sava's face the way some knew weather signs, sensed an inwardness in the old man that did not match public success. At first he thought it was simple tiredness. Restoration had drawn on Sava's strength. Though steady, he was 79, and even steady bones feel a season's labour. But the inward look remained even on easier mornings. Sometimes Sava would pause near the empty shrine niche by the rock face, and stand as if listening to water no one else heard. One fog-heavy dawn, when the air was so dense the hedges seemed to float without roots, Elian asked quietly, "Are you pleased?" Sava raised the hood on his lantern, though it was not lit. "Yes, but—" The old man gave him a long look, not annoyed, only weighing whether the question belonged to the boy who asked it. At last he said, "When a thing one has carried alone for many years is finally lifted by other hands, relief and emptiness sometimes arrive together." Elian frowned. "Emptiness?" Sava touched the post at Broken Willow where the restored lantern now hung. "For a long time, this road was my work because it was no one else's work. I knew its failures and stubbornness as one knows an old coat. If it becomes the town's road again, that is right. Yet part of me wonders what shape remains for a man who has organised his nights around what others forgot." Elian walked beside him in silence. The mist dampened his lashes. He had not imagined that a happy change could bring a sorrowful edge. The thought was gentle, though, not frightening. like seeing late summer light touch the first yellow leaf. "What shape do you want?" he asked at last. Sava smiled faintly. "At my age, wanting is a smaller matter than noticing," they went on. Not a few days later, Sava invited Elian farther up the road than they had yet travelled together. Past Broken Willow beyond the toll arch, past the alder marsh crossing repaired with new plank edges, the route rose into low hills where the air dried and smelled of thyme crushed underfoot. Stone walls appeared, half fallen and fern-grown. They came at length to a ridge from which the river town lay in the distance, like a cluster of pale shells beside a silver ribbon. There stood the remains of a watch shelter, 3 walls of fieldstone, a roof long gone, and beside it a squat pillar with iron stubs on either side. "This," said Sava, "was the upper lamp." Elian ran a hand over the pillar. "There was a lantern here too?" "In the fog months, and a bell rope once to guide travellers in white weather." The rope ran down through an eyelet to the shelter, one pull every few breaths if mist closed hard enough. He crouched and cleared away some fallen leaves from the base of the pillar. A small cavity appeared, cleverly mortared into the stone. From inside, wrapped in decayed cloth and surprisingly dry, Sava drew a narrow wooden box. Elian stared. "What is that?" "Something I hoped had survived." The box was cedar, its lid fitted with a brass slide. Time had darkened the grain, but when Sava opened it, the contents remained orderly. 2 folded papers sealed in wax gone brittle, a little tin compass with a cracked glass face, and a small iron badge in the shape of a lantern. "My brother and I left these when the upper lamp stopped being lit," Sava said. "We thought someone would come for them sooner than this." Elian did not move. A breeze stirred the dry grasses on the ridge. "What are the papers?" Sava handed him one. The seal split cleanly at the touch. Inside lay a page written in a firm hand browned by years. It was a list of maintenance intervals for the old guide points. Clean horn panes every 7 nights in wet weather, trim wicks each 3rd evening, clear drainage below the willow bend after hard rain, inspect marsh planks at thaw, keep spare flint in the toll box, never leave the upper lamp unlit if valley fog rises from the river after moonset. At the bottom were 2 names, Terran Vey, Sava Vey. Elian read them twice. "The other paper," he whispered. Sava opened it himself. This one was shorter, a note addressed to whoever next kept the road lights. It said that roads remain not through stone alone, but through those willing to walk them in weather, and that a lantern lit for strangers is never wasted oil. Sava folded the note carefully. For the first time since Elian had known him, the old watchman's hands did not seem entirely steady. "Was your brother the one who—" Elian began, then stopped, unwilling to shape a clumsy question around a loss that had not been given to him fully. Sava saved him the trouble. "He died in a winter fever, many years ago, not on the road, at home. I was already walking nights by then, and when the upper lamps were closed for economy, I could not bear to throw away everything at once. So we stored what remained here. Or rather, I stored it. He was gone by then." He looked out over the valley. "For a long time I kept walking because he no longer could. Then I kept walking because the road still needed feet. After enough years, those reasons weave together." Elian held the maintenance sheet, as if it were cloth so fine a rough breath might fray it. "Will you put them back?" "No," said Sava. "I think they've waited long enough." They stayed on the ridge a while, not speaking much. The silence was companionable, filled with cicada song and the soft ticking of dry seed heads against stone. At last, Sava gave Elian the iron lantern badge. "I cannot take this." "You can. It is only useful if carried forward. Elian turned it over in his palm, simple, worn smooth at the edges, yet the weight of it seemed larger than iron should allow. Autumn arrived in patient layers. Morning sharpened. Traders wore thicker cloaks. The road took on new smells. Apples, smoke from hedge-clear fires, wool warmed by animal bodies, wet leaves. Traffic along the Lantern Road steadied enough that the town council finally did what councils do after ordinary people have already begun the real work. They formalised it. A schedule was posted for upkeep. North Quarter households would provide rotating labour after storms. The River Guild agreed to store oil for 2 outer lanterns through the fog season. Toll Arch and Broken Willow were named official guide points again for the first time in decades. There was also in the same notice a line that drew Elian's eyes more than once. It stated that a junior assistant to the night watch would be taken on during the cold months to learn the route, inspect the guide lamps and report on outer road conditions. He looked up from the notice with his heart thumping. Sava, standing beside him, said, "Your mother must agree. She might. She must." "She might," Elian repeated, trying not to grin too hard. His mother did agree, though, not before considering matters with the grave attention she gave to dye ratios and winter flour. "You will still carry water. You will still cut kindling. And you will not let pride make you foolish merely because a lantern is involved." "I won't." "You say that now because you have never yet been proud with a lantern." Still, her eyes were smiling. So when the first long autumn fogs began to gather on the river, Elian walked officially beside Sava on the night watch. He had his own smaller lantern now, repaired from an old stable light with mica panes and a new handle bound in cord. The first night he carried it through the North Quarter, he felt absurdly tall, though he was no taller than before. The town at night had a different soul than the town at dawn. By late evening, shutters were closed. Hearth smoke hung low, and the streets belonged to softer sounds. Banked fires, distant snoring mules, the drip of eaves, the turning of someone sleepless on an upper floor. Their lanterns passed over carved door lintels, stacked barrels, sleeping cats, and the brass rings of moored barges. At the grain yard, the storehouses breathed out the mingled smells of wool, straw, salt, and dry wood. Beyond the gate, the dark widened. Fog turned the road intimate. Their lights gathered the world inward to a few yards of hedge, ditch, and pale path. Seva taught him how to judge whether a guide lantern's wick had been trimmed too close, how to shield a flame from crosswind with the body rather than the hand, say how to test a plank bridge by the answer it gave under weight. They listened for irregular water in the ditches. They checked whether a storm had dropped branches across the path. Sometimes they met late travellers and led them through the worst of the mist. Sometimes they found no one at all, and the work was simply to keep the road ready for whoever might need it before dawn. On one such night, after relighting the lantern at Broken Willow, they heard a faint bell from farther out than any traveller would usually be. It came again, then stopped. Sava tilted his head. Pack bell, light load, one animal. They waited. Out of the fog emerged a small mule, and behind it a bent old man in a patched sheepskin vest carrying 2 baskets balanced on a yoke. The baskets was covered with the oilcloth, and fragrant enough to announce themselves before the man spoke. "Apples," he said cheerfully, perhaps in answer to their unasked question. "And quince. My daughter's little one took fever at sunset. Herb woman in town said she'd prepare willow bark and meadow mint if I could fetch it tonight." Sava nodded and turned his lantern so the man could see the drier edge of the path. "You chose well using this road. The western track will be mud to the knees." "So I remembered," said the old man, though I half feared memory had made it kinder than truth. "Sometimes," said Sava, "truth improves when tended." They guided him to town and back as far as the gate after he received his parcel from Mara. The old man's baskets, once emptied of fruit for barter, Iso returned holding herbs wrapped in cloth and a small jar of salve. When he thanked them, the gratitude was quiet and full, and Elian understood more deeply than before what Sava had meant months earlier by quieter kinds of use. Winter did not come harshly that year. It came with mist, then frost, then a sequence of clear cold mornings when the road rang faintly under hoof. The lantern road held. Traders still used it, though less heavily. Villagers came with winter apples, hard cheese, spun wool, and bundles of broom sedge. From town went salt, paper, needles, copper patch plates, and lengths of blue-dyed thread that Elian's mother sold faster than she had in years. The reopened route changed their household in gentle ways. There was more work, but it was chosen work, not desperate scrambling. His mother could plan 2 markets ahead. She bought a stronger stirring paddle for the dye vats and a better winter cloak for Elian's youngest sister. They did not speak of prosperity. That word belonged to men like Darrow Sen with ledgers. But there was steadiness, and in many houses steadiness is the better blessing. Then, on the longest night stretch of the year, when stars shone hard and the river smoked under cold, Sava did something unexpected. He handed Elian the main lantern, not the small mica one. The old horn-paned watch lantern with the polished handle and deep amber glow. Elian stared. "Why?" "Because your hand no longer shakes when you lift it." The boy took the lantern carefully. It was heavier than he had imagined, or perhaps the feeling made it so. Light washed over his knuckles and touched the badge hidden in his pocket. They walked from the harbour steps through the sleeping town. The road they had once cleared alone now bore signs of many hands. Swept edges, newly pegged shutters at the grain yard, mule tie ropes neatly coiled under cover, spare wick stored in a clay jar by the gate. At Broken Willow the outer guide lamp burned cleanly. At Toll Arch, a second lamp answered across the mist. Up the road, somewhere beyond sight, another traveller's bell moved faintly and steadily toward town. Sava stopped near the old post in the grain yard where mule rings caught the lantern glow. "You asked me once why I walk the same road," he said. Elian nodded. "I've given you many answers, and all of them were true, though none alone was the whole. I walked it because my brother had, because work neglected grows lonely, because roads feed towns, because someone ought to notice when a hinge loosens or water loses its ditch, because habits, if honourable, can become a kind of prayer, and because I believed that if I kept the way in memory long enough, others might one day remember it with me." He looked toward the north gate, where the darkness opened into the restored road. "They have." Elian held the lantern and felt more than understood the fullness of that simple sentence. Not triumph, not ending. Something quieter and broader. A long labour settling into many hands. "Will you stop walking it?" he asked. Sava smiled, and the expression was like lamplight touching old oak. "Not tonight." They continued on. In the weeks that followed, Sava began, little by little, to let Elian do more. The boy checked latches, noted washouts, relit guide lamps, and spoke with late travellers while Sava listened nearby. Sometimes the old watchman would ask, "What do you see?" And Elian, who once would have answered only a post or a ditch, now said things like water holding where the edges softened, or a hook straining from side pull, or an orchard gate that would trouble pack animals if the lower hinge fails. Each time Sava's brows lifted just slightly, which was praise enough. One late winter afternoon, when pale sun lay across the grain yard and the air smelled of sawdust and apples stored too long, Darrow Sen came again in his green coat. He inspected the now busy North Storehouse, made notes in his ledger, and informed the town clerk that regular spring contracts would proceed by both River and Lantern Road. There was profit in this for many people, this and practical satisfaction for more. But what Elian noticed most was not Darrow's ledger or Hesse's nod or the clerk's ink-stained importance. It was that Sava, standing a little apart, looked peaceful rather than burdened. That evening, as they walked toward Broken Willow under a sky the colour of unglazed clay, Elian asked, "Is the emptiness gone?" Sava was quiet for some time. The hedges held the first secret stirrings of spring buds. Their lantern light moved over thaw-soft earth and roots shiny with meltwater. "Not gone," he said at last, "but changed. Emptiness is not always a thing to be filled. Sometimes it is space made for what comes next." "What comes next?" The old man glanced at him. "What do you think?" Elian looked ahead. At the road, neither crowded nor forgotten now. At the lamp swinging cleanly at Broken Willow. At the damp ditch carrying water exactly where it should. At his own hand steady on the lantern. "Walking," he said. "Yes," said Sava. "Walking and watching and mending what asks to be mended." Years later, people in the river town would speak of the season, when the Lantern Road returned as if it had been inevitable, as if roads rose naturally from neglect the way grass rises after rain. But Elian would remember more truthfully. He would remember the first hidden ring in the grain yard post, the first bramble cut back from the stone edge, the first traveller who trusted the half-forgotten route, the first guide lamp relit against fog. He would remember barley tea on a mossed milestone, old papers in a cedar box, and the way an old man's steady hands taught a town to notice what it had nearly lost. For now, though, he was still 12, then nearly 13, and the nights remained simple in the best way. He walked with Sava. He carried light. He listened to the road. Spring returned with wet winds and bright shoots in the ditches. The river widened, green and silver under moving cloud. Lambs called from upland fields. Brackenfold sent more cheeses. Low fern sent baskets lined with fresh willow leaves. The Western Market sent down fine needles and blue glass beads in trade for wool and resin. At the north gate, the guidepost cast a longer shadow. Children who had once thought the road ended at the warehouses now played at caravan, loading pebbles into baskets and arguing over who got to be mule driver. One evening, Elian found his younger sister doing exactly that with a broken stool and 3 onions. She declared the stool a pack mule and demanded the passage through the grain yard. He granted it after inspection of her imaginary resin tax. The world, he thought, had become subtly more itself. When the first anniversary of the trial caravan approached, the town did not hold a grand festival. That would not have suited them. Instead, the North Quarter arranged a shared evening meal in the grain yard. Longboards were laid on barrels. Bread came from the baker, cheese from Brackenfold, preserved pears from a widow whose orchard now sold again, and onion pies from 3 households who argued mildly over whose crust was flakiest. Lanterns hung from hooks along the sheds. The children were allowed to stay up past their usual hour and fell asleep anyway against coats and baskets before moonrise. Sava sat near the old post with a cup of hot broth between his hands. People came by to speak with him, some awkwardly, some with open gratitude, some pretending to discuss only drainage or mule temperament, when what they truly wished to offer was thanks. he received it all with the same modest gravity. Elian, carrying platters and refilling cups, watched from a little distance until Sava crooked a finger and beckoned him closer. "Sit," the old man said. Elian sat. Across the yard, Hesse was laughing with the cooper. Mara, the herb woman, had fallen into a doze beside a basket of rosemary. Darrow Sen, to his own surprise, seemed to be enjoying onion pie. Overhead the lanterns moved gently in the night breeze, bright and steady. "This," said Sava, looking not at the tables but toward the north gate beyond them, "is why roads matter." Elian followed his gaze. The gate stood open. Beyond it, the first stretch of the lantern road lay pale in moonlight, edged with hedge and new grass, leading out toward villages, orchards, marsh planks, toll arch, ridge lamp, and all the places that were no longer forgotten in quite the same way. "Because of trade?" Elian asked, though he knew it was not only that. "Because of relation," said Sava. "Trade is one form of relation. So are messages, herbs fetched at night, stories carried over distance, help arriving before weather closes. Roads are promises shaped in earth." Elian sat very still, letting the words rest where they wished inside him. After the meal, when dishes had been stacked and sleeping children gathered up, Elian walked home with his mother and sisters through streets washed silver by the moon. At the back door his mother paused and looked toward the lane where, on so many mornings, he had once hidden badly to watch a lantern pass. "You've grown," she said. He glanced down at himself, puzzled. "Since supper?" She laughed under her breath and kissed the top of his head. "Go to bed, road keeper." He lay awake for a little while beneath the eaves, listening to the familiar night sounds. A shutter settling, water in the barrel, one sister sighing in sleep. Far away, so faint it might have been memory, the tap of a staff on stone and the soft swing of a lantern moving through the darkness with patient purpose. Seasons would continue, years would gather. Sava would not walk forever, because no one does. But the road was no longer held in one pair of feet, and that had changed the shape of many lives, including Elian's own. He understood now that a useful thing need not be grand. It need only be tended, a road, a dye vat, a lantern hinge, a family table with one place still kept ready. Quiet works, repeated faithfully, could call a forgotten path back into the world, and so the lantern road remained open, not by miracle but by care. Its drains ran, its guide lights answered fog, its posts held ropes again, pack bells moved along it at dawn and dusk, children learned its bends by name, travellers blessed it in passing and went on. In the grain yard the old mule rings shone gradually brighter where new ropes polished them. In the ridge shelter, swallows nested under a repaired beam. At Broken Willow, the lantern burned through misty nights with an amber steadiness that could be seen from a long way off. And many who saw it felt their shoulders loosen before they even reached town. As for Elian, he kept waking before dawn, though now he no longer hid. Some mornings he walked beside Sava, some mornings a little ahead, testing the path with careful boots. Some mornings, when the old watchman lingered at the gate to speak with a trader or warm his hands around a cup, Elian went on first to check the outer lamp and the marsh planks and the curve where water sometimes pooled after rain. He always came back with news, a loose stone reset, a ditch running well, one hook to mend, one traveller expected by noon. He learned that the road always had another small task waiting, and that this was not a flaw in the road, but part of its life. On the quietest nights, when fog softened the world, and the lantern glow made every raindrop seem briefly golden, he felt that he was walking not only a path between town and upland, but a path between before and after, between what had nearly been lost and what had been patiently restored. The feeling was solemn and sweet. It did not make him sad. It made him careful. And carefulness, he would learn, is one of the gentlest forms of love. So the night watchman walked the same road, and the boy walked it too, and the road beneath them, once dim and disregarded, came to know their steps the way a well-used tool knows the hands that keep it clean. The river towns slept and woke. Trade ebbed and returned. Mist gathered, lanterns burned, and old stones breathed under open air again. The world did not become perfect. Roads still needed clearing. Gates still sagged. Rain still found weak edges. But usefulness had returned, and with it, a certain peace. In time, people crossing the north gate at dawn would see two lights where once there had been one. The deeper amber swing of Sava's horn lantern, and beside it the smaller, steadier gleam carried by Elian. The lights moved together through the mist, patient as memory, practical as work, calm as evening prayer. And if a traveller far up the road caught sight of them and felt less alone, then the oil was not wasted, the walking was not wasted, and the same old road, kept faithfully under quiet stars, had become once more what it had always been waiting to become, a way home. Our second story begins as we follow the wind down to a pale coastal village where the sea never quite stopped speaking. It spoke in the long hush over the tidal flats at dawn, in the clatter of loose shells rolled by the retreating water, in the soft striking of mast ropes against tarred poles, and in the thin cries of gulls turning above the fish sheds with their patient, quarrelsome grace. The village stood where a broad estuary widened toward the open coast, and because the land there was never entirely certain whether it wished to be earth or water, everything in that place had learned to bend a little. Roofs were weighted with smooth stones. Doors were braced with extra bars against the salt wind. Walkways stood on short pilings where wintertide sometimes pressed inland. Nets were dried high, baskets were woven tight, and even the willow fences leaned at the same angle, as though following some old lesson taught by the weather. The houses were lime-washed in colours that looked white in sun and pearl grey in mist. Their shutters were painted with chalky blues and sea greens that faded beautifully in the wind. Some roofs were tiled, some thatched with marsh reed, some patched so many times with sailcloth and tarred canvas that they resembled old maps of changing shores. The fish sheds nearer the water were blackened by pitch and age. The salt storehouses farther inland were built of timber frames filled with pale clay, and their windows were narrow against storms. On the rise above the harbour stood a square bell tower with a weathercock shaped like a herring. Beyond the last row of cottages the estuary opened into long silver shallows, mud-bright channels and reed islands that moved with tide and season, until at last the whole shining waste met the darker line of the outer sea. In that village lived a girl of 13 named Talia. She lived with her father, who mended sailcloth and sealed fish barrels with neat, patient hands, with her stepmother Ina, who wove reed mats and stitched strong carrying sacks for traders, and with a baby half-brother named Moss, who slept in a willow cradle beside the hearth, and regarded the whole world with solemn surprise. Talia had once lived alone with her father after her own mother died, when she was still small enough to be carried on one hip. Later, Ina came from a marsh hamlet upriver, bringing quiet skill, a cedar chest, a voice soft as rushes in evening wind, and a manner of working that made the house larger without ever making herself larger within it. Talia loved her, though sometimes in the uncertain way young people love what they fear they have not fully earned. There are homes in which affection arrives all at once like summer rain. There are others where it gathers in drops, shines briefly, vanishes into wood grain, returns, and over the years becomes something deeper because it was never forced. Talia's home was of the second kind. Their cottage stood near the upper rope walk where the land rose just enough to keep the winter floods from entering by the back step. From the front window one could see the harbour masts and part of the bell tower. From the back one could see the reed beds, and on very clear evenings, the faint pale line of the old causeway that crossed the flats toward the abandoned salt houses of Far Reach. When Talia was younger, she had thought it was only a trick of moonlight, a seam stitched through the marsh by the moon itself. Later she learned that it was stone and shell lime, laid long ago by hands no one in the village now named easily. By then hardly anyone used it. Traders preferred the new creek channel where shallow barges could come in with the tide, and in poor weather the causeway sank under silt, weed, and glimmering pools that made it look less like a road than a memory of one. Yet every evening, no matter the weather, someone walked it. Talia knew this before she knew the walker's name. At dusk, when the kitchen dimmed and Ina lit the lamp by the cradle, Talia would sometimes stand at the back window and see a moving speck of amber out upon the flats. The light went with the same measured pace from the village edge toward Far Reach, and later returned, fainter at first and then clearer as it neared. On fog nights there was also a bell, not the bell tower's broad iron voice, but a smaller, gentler note that seemed to come from the mist itself. No one in the house spoke much of it. In a place where tides rose and withdrew by laws older than anyone's trade, regular things were not always explained, they were simply trusted. But Talia was a child of noticing. She noticed the different sound of dry reed against wet reed. She noticed how storm gulls flew lower than fair weather gulls, and she noticed which barrels her father sealed with extra care because they were bound not for fish, but for quince syrup or lamp oil. She noticed that Ina stitched the corners of market sacks more tightly for shell lime than for salt, because shell lime leaked like powdery breath. And she noticed that though everyone seemed to accept the light on the flats, hardly anyone looked toward it for more than a glance. One evening in late spring, when the estuary smelled of fennel and mud warmed by the first long sun, Talia asked her father while he shaved a new bung for a barrel, "Who walks the causeway every night?" He fitted the wood, tested it, and only then answered, "Malin Shaw." "Who is she?" "The tide watch." "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, still working, "she watches the tide." Talia waited for more, but sometimes fathers, or especially fathers who have long worked with their hands, believe a sentence should be no longer than the task needs. When it became plain that no second explanation would arrive, Ina looked up from the reed mat she was binding and smiled a little. "Malin keeps the old line across the flats," she said. "Or rather, she has kept it so long that people speak as if the line keeps itself through her. She's older than the bell tower plaster and twice as stubborn. In my first year here, I asked why she still crossed when no one traded by Far Reach anymore. Your father told me the same thing he's told you." Talia looked from one to the other. "That she watches the tide?" "Yes," said Ina, "which is true and not very helpful." Her father's mouth twitched, though he did not fully smile. "Why does no one else do it?" Talia asked. "Because she has always done it," he said. This answer was even less satisfying than the first. Talia carried it away with her after supper, and stood in the dimming yard until the amber light appeared. It moved steadily along the pale seam of the causeway, while the flats gleamed pewter under a lifting moon. She had the strange feeling that the light knew exactly where the stones lay beneath silt and tide sheen, and that if she were to step out there alone she would lose the path within 6 paces, though it lay plainly before her eyes. She watched until Ina called her in. The next evening she watched again, the next after that as well. By the 5th evening she'd begun to guess the walker's pace. By the 7th she realised the light left a little earlier on full tides and a little later on neap tides. By the 9th she understood that the bell rang only when fog thickened over the middle flats, or when the moon was dark. On the 10th evening she slipped from the yard before anyone noticed, and went down past the salt sheds to the place where the old causeway began. The village edge gave way there to a line of whitewashed marker stones half sunk in marram grass. Beyond them stretched the flats, broad and softly shining, streaked with water channels and tufted with patches of sea lavender not yet in bloom. The causeway itself rose no higher than a hand's breadth above the mud in most places. It was made of pale shell-set stones, some exposed, some hidden under a skim of silt or wrack. At low water it could be followed by eye if one knew where to look. At half-light it seemed at once obvious and impossible. Malin Shaw was just then approaching the first marker. She was 82 years old, though Talia learned the exact number only later. At first she saw only a straight-backed elderly woman in a dark reed-coloured cloak with the hood down, carrying a broad lantern in one hand and a hooked staff in the other. Her hair, what could be seen of it under a tied kerchief, was white as dried bone. Not the frail white of thin age, but the bright white of salt on stone. Her face was long and lined by years of sea wind rather than by softness. Her eyes, when they fell upon Talia standing inconveniently in the bath, were the clear grey-green of shallow water over sand. "Have you come to block the tide?" Malin asked. Talia startled. "No." "Good. It dislikes competition." The lantern glowed between them. It was a sturdy thing of brass and horn, with a vented cap blackened by long use. The staff was ashwood, worn, smooth at the grip and bound with copper wire near the hook. Talia swallowed. "I wanted to know where you go." "Far Reach. Every night. When the tide allows." "Why?" Malin considered her as the wind moved lightly across the flats. "Because the causeway does not remember itself by wishing." Talia felt the answer land in her like a pebble dropped into still water. "Can I come?" "No." The word was so calm that it held no insult in it, only boundary. Talia opened her mouth and closed it again. "You may come tomorrow," Malin said. "If your people agree, if you wear boots that tie well, and if you can walk without asking the tide to wait for you." That last part sounded almost like a test, and Talia, who had a private habit of hurrying whenever she cared too much, recognised at once that she was being seen more clearly than she preferred. At supper she asked. Her father frowned first, then thought. Ina tied off a length of reed and rested it in her lap. Moss snored softly in his cradle, as though to show that important family decisions should not trouble his sleep. "With Malin?" her father said. "Yes." "To Far Reach?" "Yes." "At low tide?" "Yes." He went quiet, which in him meant concern rather than refusal. Ina said, "If Malin invited her, she means to keep her useful." "That is not the same as safe," he said. "It is, with Malin." He set down his spoon and looked at Talia. "You do not step from the causeway because something shiny catches your eye. You do not test mud with both feet at once. You do not run ahead in fog. If Malin says stop, you stop before she has finished the word." "I will." He studied her a little longer, then nodded once. "Then go." Ina rose after supper and fetched from her cedar chest an old marsh cloak lined with wool and patched at both elbows. "This was my brother's before he outgrew patience and good sense," she said. "It still holds wind." Talia put it on. It smelled faintly of cedar, brine, and the herbs Ina tucked into the chest corners each winter. The gift warmed her as much as the cloak itself. The next evening the tide had gone out broad and glossy, leaving behind channels that caught the sunset in long strips of copper. Talia met Malin at the first marker stone. The old woman carried her usual lantern and staff, but also a coil of cord, a flat shovel and a leather satchel that gave a clinking, practical sound. "You came," Malin said. "I said I would." "That helps," said Malin. "Now listen. The causeway's not the shore. The shore forgives wandering. The flats do not. Keep your feet where I put mine unless I tell you otherwise." They set out. At first Talia hardly dared breathe. The causeway underfoot felt narrower once the village was behind them. On either side the flats stretched outward in pale quiet, scored with thin runnels that glittered and disappeared. Here and there stood old guide poles, some upright, some leaning, with ragged wisps of faded cloth tied near their tops. Small crabs clicked sideways in pools no larger than platters. Curlews called from the farther marsh islands, with long, melancholy notes that seemed too large for the empty evening. "What do you carry in the satchel?" Talia asked after several minutes. "Things worth carrying." "What things?" "A small hammer, nails wrapped in oilskin, white chalk, wick, a tin for lamp oil, twine, a folding rule, 2 shell pegs, a piece of dry cloth, 1 little jar of lime paste, needle and cord, a cork float, a fishbone awl, and a biscuit too stale to attract pity." Talia smiled. "You may laugh," Malin said, "but it is wise to carry what a road asks for before it asks." "This is a road." "This is a causeway, which is simply a road that must make peace with water twice a day," they went on. The air smelled of salt, mud, fennel, and the faint sweetness of drying rack. The sound beneath everything was the far breathing of the outer tide. Closer at hand came quieter sounds. Her own boots on shell-set stone, Malin's staff touching at intervals, the ticking of tiny shells moved by the last draining threads of water. About halfway out, the causeway widened where several pale stones formed a little standing place above the flats. Beside it stood a low hut no taller than Malin's shoulder at the eaves. It had been built on a foundation of piled stone with walls of plank and reed thatch plastered in shell lime. One side leaned. The little door hung from one hinge. A rusted bell frame rose above it with no bell on the crossbar. Talia stopped. "What is this?" "Tide house," said Malin. Or it was. Shelter, lamp point, bell point, and sometimes a place to set down loads when weather turned spiteful. Does anyone use it? I do. Sparrows do. Wind certainly does. Malin set down the lantern, wedged her staff, and lifted the fallen door enough to close it more properly against the frame. Then she crouched beside the threshold and scraped away packed mud with a flat stick from her satchel. Water at once trickled out. "A door should not stand with wet feet," she murmured, mostly to herself. Talia watched, puzzled and fascinated at once. She'd imagined the walk as a mystery, perhaps solemn, perhaps ceremonial. Instead, Malin was tending a doorway. "Why do you keep doing this?" Talia asked. Malin looked up. "Doing what?" "Coming here, fixing things no one sees." The old woman straightened slowly. Wind moved the corner of her kerchief. "You think no one sees because no one speaks. That is a village error. Plenty is seen, and little is said. The causeway may look empty, but shepherds from Reed End still cross in dry summers. Salt gatherers use the far pans in lean years. A healer came this way twice last winter when the creek channel froze at the bend. Even when no one walks it, the tide studies what has been neglected. If I let it take one loose stone, then two, then a side seam, the whole line will soften. Once softened, it vanishes quickly." Talia listened. The low sun has turned the wet flats to rose and silver. Beyond the tide house, the causeway continued toward a blur of sheds and low mounds on the farther shore. Far reach. "What is there now?" she asked. "Old salt beds, 2 storehouses, a drying yard, and a chapel with no priest," said Malin. "Also geese, wind, and memories, if you count those." She handed Talia the dry cloth. "Wipe the lantern glass while I look at the hinge." So Talia wiped hornpanes clear of salt bloom, while Malin tightened the hinge pin with a nail and a few measured taps of the hammer. It was small work, yet when they set out again the lantern burned brighter, and the tide house door no longer gaped foolishly in the wind. Far Reach proved stranger and gentler than Talia had imagined. It was not a ruin exactly, though much of it had the patient stillness of disuse. The shore there rose in low ridges of shell and salt grass. At the edge stood long rectangular beds, bordered with clay banks, where seawater had once been trapped and dried into salt. Beyond them lay storehouses with shutters mostly closed, their lime wash flaking into soft patches. A little chapel no bigger than a net shed stood with a driftwood cross above its lintel. Nearby a line of racks leaned where fish or rushes had once been hung. Everything wore the pale, crusted hush of a place accustomed to wind. But it was not dead. Smoke rose from one chimney. A flock of geese worked determinedly between the salt beds. At the far storehouse an old man sat mending baskets from split reed. He raised a hand when he saw Malin and seemed unsurprised to see a child beside her. "You have found a spare pair of eyes," he called. "Borrowed," Malin replied. She led Talia not to the houses first, but to a stone plinth near the old drying yard. On it stood an iron post with the empty bracket. "This was the far lamp," Malin said, "once lit on autumn fogs and spring neaps. Traders could sight it from mid-flat and hold the line. What happened to it? Bracket rusted through. Lamp glass broke. Yeah, no one replaced what the barges made less necessary." She touched the iron lightly. "Still sound at the root, though." Then she began her evening's work. Talia learned that Malin did not simply walk to Far Reach and back. Each journey had its stations, and each station had its attentions. At the far lamp plinth, Malin checked whether the iron base shifted in the ground. At the chapel wall she inspected the rain barrel and cleared the gutter spout with a strip of bent willow. At the old salt beds she gauged how much silt the last tides had left over the western bank. At the racks she retied a loose brace with waxed cord. At the tide house she noted whether the threshold channel ran free. At the middle flats she studied the reed markers and the colour of the mud on either side of the stones, and reading firmness and drift the way others read a page. Talia followed, carrying tools when asked. The wind deepened. The western sky faded from peach to pearl. By the time they turned back, Malin had hung a small bell from the tide house frame using a leather loop from her satchel. Its note, when she tested it, was soft, but clear. "For fog," she said. "Did you bring that today?" Talia asked. "No. It has lived in the tide house chest for years. I decided it was lonely." Talia laughed again. On the walk back the moon rose. The causeway gleamed pale ahead of them. Water whispered in the side channels as the tide thought about returning. "Will you come tomorrow?" Malin asked as the village markers neared. "If I may?" "You may. Bring a short-handled brush if your household owns one." They did own one, and because Talia asked before dawn, her father unearthed it from the shed where it had last been used to scrub deck tar. Ina tied the cracked handle with cord and wrapped the head in cloth to keep it from shedding more bristles than it kept. That evening Talia brought it proudly, and Malin, after a glance, said, "Good. A brush that has worked before can usually work again." So began a season of evenings on the causeway. Not every evening, because homes have their claims. Some nights Talia had to mine moss while Ina finished market orders. Some nights her father needed help carrying sealed barrels to the upper quay. Some nights weather closed too fast, or the tide turned wrong for an inexperienced walker. But when she could go, she went, and the pale line across the flats entered her as thoroughly as the village lanes had once done. Yes, she learned to recognise the causeway by feel as much as sight. The main stones held a faint, gritty smoothness from old shell lime, different from the slick drag of mud or the hollow sink of reed roots. She learned where the tide licked closest on spring highs, where eelgrass snagged at boots, where one must step wide around a cracked edge stone until it could be reset. She learned that curlew cries often meant the farther pools were draining, and that the first returning gulls rode the inward tide before the water itself seemed near. She learned the names of things nearly everyone else had stopped naming. The little standing place before the tide house was Lantern Rest. The narrow point where the causeway bent around a deep runnel was Needle Turn. The long straight stretch beyond it, where the wind always met them head-on, was Seam Mile. A cluster of shell mounds near Far Reach was called the White Steps, though no steps remained. The farthest salt bed, overgrown with glasswort and sea pink, was Maiden Pan. Malin said names mattered because they held use in them. "If you no longer call a place by its working name," she said, "you begin to walk past its purpose." One evening, as they brushed dried weed and shell fragments from the exposed stones at Needle Turn, Talia asked, "Was this road busy once?" Malin gave the weed pile a nudge with her boot so the rising tide would carry it clear. Very, before the creek channel deepened and the traders favoured barges, before the new quay at North Inlet took much of the salt business, before the Western Road improved enough for carts in dry months. Far Reach sent salt bricks, smoked mussels, cockles packed in clay jars, reed mats, and shell lime inland. From the villages came barley flour, crockery, wool, lamp oil and timber too precious to waste on marsh ground. There were days when this line held 12 donkeys before noon. Talia tried to imagine that many animals and voices on the causeway and found that she could once she closed her eyes a little against the present quiet. "Did you walk it then too?" "Yes." "How old were you?" "Old enough to mind where I put my feet and young enough to think weather was merely an inconvenience," Talia smiled. "And now?" "Now I know weather is a teacher, though not always a kind one." It was on the 9th evening, while they were clearing drift from the rain barrel behind the chapel, that Talia first asked the question she'd been carrying. "Why do you walk the same road still?" Malin did not answer right away, so she tilted the barrel, listened to the slosh, and set it straight again so the loosened leaves floated free. At last she said, "Most people who ask that mean to tell me I may stop. I don't." "No, no." The old woman's expression softened almost invisibly. "Then hear the longer answer. I was born at Far Reach when the pan still shone white each summer and the storehouses smelled of salt, wet reed and smoked fish. My mother kept account of the drying yard. My father made lamp frames and tide hooks. In the fog months he walked the causeway each night to trim the middle lamp and ring the bell if the mist came down thick from the sea. When he grew too stiff in the knees, I walked with him. Later, after he died, I walked alone. Then others stopped needing the line every day, but some still needed it some days, and even when no one came, I knew what the tide could do to neglected stone." She paused. The chapel wall held the last warmth of the day. There is another reason. Talia waited. I had a wife, Malin said. Her name was Hesper. She came from upriver with a string of ducks, 3 baskets of quince, and the most terrible boots ever made by a cobbler. She slipped on the causeway the first week she lived here, cursed the whole estuary in a voice like a bell, and married me before winter. She kept the far lamp with me for 32 years. When she died, I went on walking because the route still needed feet. But I also went on because it had been our road, and a road walked in company leaves that company behind in it. I suppose I was unwilling to let the tide smooth her out. Talia, who had never heard anyone in the village say such a thing plainly, stood very still. The wind tugged the edge of her borrowed marsh cloak. In the silence that followed, there was no awkwardness, only a kind of deep listening. What was she like? Talia asked at last. Practical, said Malin. Impatient with loose knots, kind to geese, suspicious of weather predictions made by men who preferred windows to doorways. She could tell shell lime by smell and never once lost the tide keys. Tide keys? Malin gave the smallest smile. We will come to those. And because they would come to them in time, the answer was enough. By early summer, Talia had begun helping in ways beyond carrying tools. She brushed the stones at low tide so their pale line showed more clearly. She scraped barnacle crust from marker posts with a fishbone awl. She mixed shell-lime paste in a broken bowl and packed it into the joints of edge stones where winter water had begun to pry them apart. She helped Malin sort old metal fittings recovered from the tide house chest. Hooks, pegs, a cracked ring, 3 nails too bent to use, 2 nails still good, and a tiny key shaped like a curled fish. Is that a tide key? Talia asked. No, said Malin. This is for the chapel chest. Tide keys are longer. She took from her satchel a pair of iron keys with heavy bow loops greened by years. The old lockbox at Far Reach and the bell locker in the village once held spare wick, oil tallies, and marker flags. Hesper kept one key, I kept the other, a system most marriages would do well to imitate. Their work remained quiet, yet signs of usefulness gathered around them. A shepherd from Reed End crossed with 2 lambs to barter for salt and eel hooks. 2 marsh women came from inland with baskets of mint and yarrow for the fishwives. A potter's son from the upper creek asked whether the flats route still held sound enough for carrying glaze jars on a donkey when the creek winds ran contrary. Malin told him the truth. Not yet for careless loads, perhaps by late summer for respectful ones. Talia repeated this phrase to Ina later while helping stitch rush mat edging. For respectful ones, Ina said with amusement, Malin speaks of roads the way priests speak of altars. Maybe roads deserve it. Ina looked up, reed needles paused in her fingers. Perhaps they do. Their household shifted gently as the season went on. Talia still felt the old tug of uncertainty sometimes. Gives her the sense that Ina and Moss formed a newer circle around her father, into which she had been welcomed but not born. Yet each evening she walked the causeway, she returned with some small practical knowledge that belonged to the whole house. She knew which tide would favour early fish buyers. She knew when sea lavender would bloom on the higher flats. She knew that a trader from Reed End might soon bring barley cakes again if the route were brushed clear through Seam Mile. These were small things, but small things, once shared, become threads in belonging. One warm evening she came home with a bundle of dried sea fennel Malin had cut from the chapel wall where it had begun to split the mortar. Ina hung it over the hearth for winter broth. On another night, Talia brought a handful of shell pegs that Malin said could reinforce the corners of carrying sacks. Her father used them to brace barrel hoops during repair. Moss, being too small to understand any of it, simply thumped his heels in delight when Talia entered, as if her arrival itself were a kind of tide. By midsummer the shortcomings of the causeway had become clear enough that Malin spoke aloud what she had likely known all along. It will not keep itself through another winter unless more than one pair of hands tends it. Talia nodded at once. They were standing near Needle Turn where a side seam of stones had slipped, and the edge gave way to a soft sucking strip of mud. Malin prodded it with her staff. The staff sank farther than she liked. "What must be done?" Talia asked. "All the dull things that save good things," said Malin. "The western edge reset here and at Seam Mile, the tidehouse roof patched before autumn rain, 2 new marker poles cut and whitewashed, the bell frame braced, the far lamp bracket reforged if anyone still remembers how, drain channels reopened where rack packs against the stones after a storm tide, and the village must remember that Far Reach exists for more than geese. Then we tell them," Malin's brow rose. "We?" "Yes." The old woman regarded her with a look that was neither refusal nor agreement, but something gentler and more exacting. "If you mean to ask people for work, you should first know the work well enough not to ask foolishly." So for the next fortnight they studied rather than petitioned. Malin showed Talia how to judge which stones had only shifted at the shoulder and which had lost their bed entirely. They measured the sag in the tidehouse beam with a plumb line made from twine and a lead fishing weight. They counted the sound marker poles and the broken ones. They listed what goods still moved between village and marsh hamlets, and what might move if the route were easier. Salt, shell lime, smoked mussels, eel baskets, rush mats, dye reeds, herb bundles, pottery, barley meal, quince syrup, lamp oil, and little coils of sail twine that inland shepherds always seem to need. Talia carried the list, written awkwardly by her own careful hand, folded inside Ina's old market ledger. She was absurdly proud of it. Then Malin sent her to talk. Not to the council first. "Villages," Malin said, "do not change by announcement. They change by kitchen doors, work benches, and people discovering that what they thought forgotten may still be worth mending." So Talia went where the work lived. She went to old Var from the smokehouse, who still bought marsh salt because he said barge salt held too much damp in its heart. She asked whether he would use more if Far Reach were easier to reach. He said yes, if the summer batches came before the mackerel ran heavy. She went to Cybele and Torin, Shellburner twins with hair the colour of driftwood and tempers no sharper than sea glass. They burned oyster shell into lime in a kiln near the upper shore, and complained every season that creek transport broke too many sacks on the turn. Would they use the causeway if its western stones were steadier? They would. Yes, if donkeys could cross without slipping, and if someone repaired the rest plinth near the white steps. She went to Mairead, the healer who lived near the bell tower and dried mint on every available sill. Mairead said she still crossed the flats twice each year for marshwort and black samphire, because the plants were better beyond Far Reach than near the village. A clearer route would help in fog, yes, and especially in autumn when the creek ferries stopped early. She went to the potter Jorin, who had once made storage jars for cockles packed in brine. He rubbed his chin and said that if the old salt sheds opened again, he could send narrow-necked jars by donkey instead of by barge, which chipped them less. He also said he still had moulds for lamp bases if someone needed them. When Talia reported these answers to Malin, the old woman listened without interrupting, then asked, "And what did you learn?" "That people still need the route." Malin shook her head slightly. Talia thought harder. "That they have reasons, but no one has put the reasons in one basket." "There," said Malin. "Now we may speak to the village." A gathering was called at the salt sheds on a low-tide evening when fish sorting had ended and before full dark. It was not an official council meeting, though the clerk came with his narrow nose and narrower pen because clerks are drawn to lists the way gulls are drawn to bright scraps. It was simply a speaking together, with Malin standing by the first white marker stone and Talia beside her holding the ledger. Around them gathered fishwives with aprons still damp from gutting boards, reed cutters, shell burners, a cooper, 2 potters, a rope maker, Raid the healer, Talia's father with barrel pitch still under one thumbnail, Ina holding moss on her hip, and several older villagers who came because they had once crossed a far reach in younger days and were curious what might be said of it now. The evening was calm, the exposed flats shone pale beyond the grass. The causeway lay plain enough to prove it had not entirely disappeared. Malin spoke first, and because she was not given to extra words, every word mattered. She did not speak of nostalgia or lost glory. She spoke of shifted stones, neglected poles, and a route still used often enough that leaving it to soften would be wasteful. She spoke of the cost of carrying shell lime and salt by creek when wind or tide ran wrong. She spoke of marsh herbs, glazed jars, and smokehouse timing. She spoke too of winter need. Dear, when a path fit for feet could matter more than a channel fit for cargo. Then Talia read from the ledger. Her voice shook only on the first sentence. After that it steadied. She named goods. She named places. She named repairs. She named who had said what and when. Listening to herself, she understood with a quiet thrill that being useful and being young were not enemies if one took care. Questions followed, of course. Would the tide house hold another season? Perhaps, if patched. Were the middle stones broad enough for donkeys? Some, not all. Could the marker poles be renewed with marsh willow? Better alder for the buried ends and whitewash above. Who would keep the far lamp if it were rehung? Malin, for now. Was there any sense in restoring a route when the barges still served? Barges served water. Not every errand began or ended at water. By the end of the evening no banner had been raised and no cheer gone up. Villages of that sort rarely celebrated with noise what they intended to do with labour. But names had been put beside tasks. Var would lend 2 spades and a handcart. The shell-burner twins would provide lime dust for mortar if someone helped carry fresh shell. Jorin the potter would inspect the old far lamp base and see whether a replacement collar could be cast in clay mould for an ironworker upriver. Talia's father would help brace the tide house beam with drift oak from the rope walk pile. The rope maker promised a coil of tarred line for the bell frame. Ina said she and 2 marsh women would weave reed screens to cut the crosswind at Seam Mile if posts could be set. It was, Talia thought as she lay in bed that night listening to the tide return with a soft secret sound, very much like watching a seam being taken up by many hands. The restoration began not with grand effort but with muddy knees. At the next series of low tides, the first task was clearing the side drains where wrack and silt had packed against the causeway edges. Water, Malin said, must be shown where to go before stone can settle well. So they dug with flat spades and scooped with boards. Talia learned to read the slicker, darker stripe that marked trapped seepage beneath the shell crust. The shell-burner twins worked with enviable calm, speaking little and lifting more than seemed reasonable. Va from the smokehouse grumbled at the mud but arrived before everyone else each evening. Raid came once with a basket of mint tea and stayed to scrape shell from the western stones until moonrise. Next came the tide house. Its roof, once reed thatch over a lattice of willow and plank, had sagged badly on the seaward side. Talia's father climbed it with the ease of one who trusted weathered wood, only after tapping it in 4 places. He cut away the rotted lashings and called down what was still sound. Ina and the marsh women passed up new reed bundles bound tight. Malin stood below, never raising her voice, simply saying now and then, "That brace holds," or "Not there, the old peg will split," in a tone that made correction feel like information rather than blame. Inside, Talia swept out years of sand, feather fluff, broken shell, and one astonishingly patient toad who had taken up residence beneath the bench. Yet in a chest at the back she found old things wrapped in sailcloth. 2 fog flags of faded blue, a brass wick trimmer, a cracked tally board for oil use, 3 shell tokens with numbers etched into them, and a pair of iron keys longer than her hand. "Tide keys," said Malin when she saw them. "What do they open?" "The bell locker in the village and the far oil chest by the chapel. They have not opened much lately." The old woman took the keys with a strange tenderness, then handed one back to Talia. "Hold this." Talia did, and felt the cold weight of old responsibility resting in her palm. While the roof was patched, other hands reset the plinth stones at Lantern Rest and White Steps. Jorin the potter indeed found the old lamp base mould in a loft behind his kiln, packed with mouse-chewed straw and surprisingly intact. The iron worker upriver, who made hinges for sluice gates and rarely hurried for anybody, agreed to forge a new collar and bracket if shell lime and eels were sent in exchange. So a donkey was loaded with both, and when the bracket returned 2 weeks later it gleamed darkly like a practical promise. Children from the upper lane were allowed to help whitewash the new marker poles, which meant that more whitewash went onto boots and sleeves than onto wood. But in time the poles shone clearly enough to guide from a distance. Talia helped set them at needle turn and seam mile. The buried ends were packed with shell grit and tamped firm. When the white tops caught sunset, the causeway looked newly named. The work had its rhythm, and rhythm is among the gentlest forms of happiness. Low tide, brush stones. Next tide, set mortar. Next clear evening, inspect. Windy day, weave screens in the yard. Still day, carry them out and lash them to posts at the exposed stretch. Wet day, sort nails and dry cord in the tide house. Every task had weather that suited it. Malin, who never hurried the tide, also never hurried the work into the wrong weather. At first Talia found this difficult. She wanted completion the way some children want praise, all at once, and soon. If the far lamp bracket had come, why not hang the lamp that very evening? If the marker poles were cut, why wait until the ground dried a little? If the tide house roof was patched, why not declare the whole route restored? But Malin would say, "Not yet," or "A road answers to sequence," or simply, "You cannot fasten mist with a nail." Talia, who had spent much of her life trying to arrive early enough at everything that she might prove her worth before it was questioned, slowly learned a quieter measure. One evening, annoyed by delay, she said, "If we always wait for the right tide, the right wind, the right dryness, the right help, we will never finish anything." Malin was kneeling by a seam of stone, pressing lime paste into the joint with a flat stick. She did not look up. "And if we do each thing in the wrong order, we will finish it twice." Talia stood with her hands full of reed ties and thought about that the whole way home. It was during those weeks that her sense of home shifted too, almost without her noticing. One morning Ina asked whether the reed screens should be doubled at the edges, because crosswind often found loose corners first. Talia answered before thinking, speaking of seam mile, of the way gusts came from the outer channel and not the marsh side, and of where the posts stood strongest. Ina listened as if this knowledge were perfectly natural for her to have. Later, when Talia came in salt-streaked and hungry after an evening on the flats, There would be warm broth already set aside and bread wrapped in cloth to keep soft. Her father began asking not, "Did you go?" but "How did needle turn hold?" and "Did the north marker take whitewash?" These were small questions, but they formed one by one the pleasant certainty that her going mattered to more than herself. Late in the summer, a sea lavender faded, and the first coolness entered the evenings. The restored far lamp was finally ready. The brass frame came from Jorin's mould, and the upriver ironworker's patience. The horn panes were salvaged from 2 different old lanterns and cut to fit. The vent cap was mended by Talia's father, who declared afterward that lamp makers must once have had fingers made entirely of wire and stubbornness. Malin cleaned the wick carrier and polished the hinge pins with an old cloth until the little door opened without complaint. At sunset on the evening they meant to hang it, much of the village followed them out as far as Lantern Rest. Not because anyone had announced a ceremony, but because when people have lifted parts of a thing, they wish to see the thing stand. Malin carried the lamp. Talia carried the oil. Var brought a ladder that had once belonged to a net loft and still smelled faintly of fish tar. Ina came with moss asleep against her shoulder. Talia's father carried the hook pins. Even the clerk came, though clerks rarely cross marsh ground for beauty alone. At far reach, the new bracket took the lamp exactly as if it had been waiting years for its proper weight. Malin climbed the lower rungs of the ladder despite protests softer than full objections, fixed the hinge pin, and nodded for Talia to hand up the oil. Together they filled the reservoir. Then Malin struck flint, touched flame to wick, and shut the little door. The lamp did not flare grandly. It simply came alive. Amber light spread over the chapel wall, the shell mounds, the whitened markers, the old salt beds where evening damp was beginning to gather. From the middle flats one would see it clearly. From the village edge too, once dark deepened. No one cheered. That would have been wrong somehow. Instead they stood in the wind and watched the lamp burn steadily while geese muttered among the pans. The quiet among them was full and companionable. At last Var said, "Well, there it is." "Yes," said Malin, "there it is." On the walk home, the far lamp shone behind them until a turn of the causeway hid it. Talia turned once more than necessary to keep it in sight. Autumn brought the proof of use. A pair of inland women came with donkeys bearing barley flour and quince preserve, crossing at first light because the creek boat had lost a day to contrary wind. A shell-lime buyer from the western road took the causeway in both directions, and later declared it sound enough for regular small loads if one avoided higher spring tides. Reed cutters from the marsh hamlets began bringing bound bundles by foot, resting them in the renewed tide house. A fishwife's cousin from upriver arrived with blue cloth and traded it for smoked mussels and salt cakes. Mairead the healer crossed twice in 1 week for marshwort, and returned praising the new marker line when the fog rose near dusk. But the return that pleased Talia most was quieter. It was the return of ordinary expectation. People began asking not whether the causeway still existed, but whether the tide house bench had been repaired, whether the middle bell was hanging yet, whether far-reach salt would come before the mackerel cured, whether the next neap would suit a crossing with jars. Usefulness had come back so naturally that conversation adjusted before anyone remarked upon it. To Talia this seemed a kind of magic more convincing than any tale of spells. She was in the smokehouse yard helping Var weigh coarse salt when she heard him tell a buyer, "Take the flats line if the creek fog thickens. The markers are up again, and Malin keeps the lamp." The sentence warmed her for hours. One evening soon after, Malin brought her beyond far reach to a rise of shell and grass behind the old chapel. There, sheltered by a low stone wall, stood a little bench and a weathered box on a post. The box was locked. Malin drew out one of the tide keys and opened it. Inside lay a folded oilcloth, a spare wick, a tally slate, and a note sealed in wax. "What is this?" Talia asked. "The far watch box," said Malin. "And this?" She held up the note, still sealed. "What is that?" "A letter Hesper and I left when we thought another keeper would soon follow us. No one ever came to claim it." Talia looked from the note to Malin's face. The old woman's expression had gone remote, not cold, only far-seeing, as if the years between had laid themselves out across the flats in one long, shining strip. "Will you read it?" Talia asked. Malin broke the seal carefully. The paper inside was thick with old fibres and smelled faintly of salt and cedar. The writing, browned by time, was neat. It was not a formal instruction, though some practical notes ran along the bottom margin. Oil use in heavy fog, bell intervals for moonless nights, warnings about the inward channel at the second autumn storms. Most of the page, however, was a message to whoever next kept the line. It said that the causeway should be walked not as a relic, but as a living measure between shore and need. That tides changed, goods changed, and weather changed, but the work of keeping passage remained honourable. That one need not be grand to guide others, only attentive, and that no lamp carried over flats was ever lit for one traveller alone. At the bottom were two names, Hesper Shaw, Malin Shaw. Talia read them twice. "You kept walking for her," she said softly. "Yes," said Malin, "at first because I could not imagine the evenings otherwise, then because the route still had its uses, then because habit and love make a durable braid if you let them." Talia folded the paper slowly. "Will you leave it here?" "For a while longer," Malin said. "Some things should remain where weather has thought about them." They sat on the bench as dusk gathered. The sea beyond the flats had turned the colour of pewter rubbed with blue. Far below, the new lamp at the chapel began to glow. The bell at the tide house gave one small note in the wind. Talia found herself saying what she'd not yet shaped aloud. "Sometimes I feel as if I'm always arriving halfway into things, into this house, into Ina's kindness, into moss already being loved, into your road, into far reach, into everything that began before me." Malin folded the letter and returned it to its oilcloth. "And what is wrong with arriving halfway?" "It means I wasn't there at the beginning." The old woman turned to look at her fully. "Child, most of life is arrived at halfway. We step into trades, roads, marriages, villages, weather patterns, songs already being sung. The beginning is not the only place one can belong. Belonging comes from tending what one has entered." The words settled so gently that Talia did not at once recognise their weight. Below them the flats shone with the first returning threads of tide. "The causeway was old before I first walked it," Malin went on. "Hesper joined it after me, you after her. Would you say the stones refused your feet because you were not first? No. Then do not imagine love is smaller-hearted than stone." They sat a while longer while evening deepened. When they rose to go, Talia felt something inside her loosen, not dramatically, but like a knot untied with patient fingers. The first true fog of autumn came a fortnight later. All day the air had been heavy, the outer sea hidden behind a white brightness that held no horizon. By dusk the fog had moved inward over the flats in slow folds, muffling the bell tower and swallowing the farther marker poles before the tide had fully gone. It was weather for bells and lamps, and the village knew it. Talia's father looked at the window, then at her. "You'll go?" It was not a question. "Yes." Ina wrapped an extra scarf around her throat and pressed a little packet of honey cake into her hand. Moss, nearly walking by then, reached from the settle with both arms until she bent to kiss his forehead. There was no uncertainty in the leave-taking, only the simple assumption that her place in the evening's work existed. At the first marker, Malin was already waiting, lantern lit, bell rope coiled over one arm. The fog had softened every edge. Even the nearest stones seemed to emerge only as the light touched them. "We ring tonight," Malin said. They crossed slowly. At lantern rest, Malin hung the rope to the frame and Talia gave 3 measured pulls. The bell answered in a low, rounded tone that seemed to travel not through air but through the fog itself. At Sea Mile, they paused to check the reed screens, slick with damp but holding. At the Tide House, the little bell chimed steadily when the wind found it. Halfway to Far Reach, they heard another sound, a donkey's halter ring, then a voice muffled by mist. Malin lifted the lantern high and Talia rang the handbell from her satchel. Out of the white dimness emerged a marsh woman with a donkey laden in careful balance. The panniers held sacks of dried rush pith and bundles of medicinal herbs wrapped in oilcloth. "Bless the lamp," the woman said softly. "I thought the white marker would vanish before needle turn." "It nearly did," said Malin. "Walk behind us." So they led her in, bell sounding at intervals, the restored markers appearing and fading like pale thoughts. At Far Reach another pair joined them for the village-ward crossing. An old fisherman carrying a jar of preserved cockles for his daughter and a boy with 3 empty salt baskets nested on his back. The little procession moved quietly through the fog with the sort of trust that is one of the oldest comforts in the world, knowing where to place one's feet because a light ahead keeps steady. Nothing dramatic occurred. No one cried out. No one slipped. Yet Talia would remember that crossing for the rest of her life because usefulness, when fully returned, often feels like that. Not loud, not astonishing, but exact. At the village edge, the marsh woman touched Talia's shoulder in thanks before turning uphill. Her hand smelled of mint and damp wool. Yeah, the old fisherman nodded once toward the flats where the bell still gave its calm note. "Good to hear that again," he said. Later, warming her hands at the hearth, Talia realized she'd been smiling for so long her cheeks ached. Winter came gently at first, with cold rain and brittle reeds. The causeway required new kinds of attention. Frost made the shell stones bright and treacherous before dawn. Storm rack piled against needle turn. The village side bell locker, opened at last with the second tide key, yielded spare leather straps, 2 fog flags, and a lantern hood Hesper herself had patched years earlier. Talia handled it with reverence, and later used the same stitching pattern to mend a market sack under Ina's direction. The route now had enough traffic that Malin could no longer claim to be its sole keeper, though she remained its surest one. On certain evenings Var crossed with a sack of smokehouse salt to trade for reeds. On others the Shellburner twins led a patient donkey along the middle stones. A widow from Reed End brought beeswax wraps and took back fish hooks and lamp chimneys. No stream of commerce ever became grand enough to transform the village into some bustling tale town. That was not the nature of the place. But the causeway had resumed its proper place among several ways of living, which is often better than being made the centre of everything. As for Talia, she found that the more she belonged to the route, the less she worried about belonging elsewhere. Not because uncertainty vanished entirely, but because she'd learned a different measure. One belonged by carrying oil, by tying a knot correctly, and even by remembering where the third marker leaned after a south wind, by answering when work called, by sitting near a cradle while reeds were bundled, by coming home with salt on one's cuffs and news worth sharing. These were not grand beginnings. They were steadier than grand beginnings. On a cold evening near midwinter, after they had checked the far lamp and hung a second windshield on the Tidehouse bell, Malin stopped at the white steps and looked back toward the village. The lights were small through the clear air. Hearth glows, a lamp up a rope walk, the tower lantern by the quay. Farther behind them the sea shone darkly under stars. "You ask fewer anxious questions now," Malin observed. Talia laughed softly. "Do I? You used to ask the road when it would be finished. Now you ask which part needs mending next. Maybe the road taught me. Roads and causeways are patient teachers. They repeat themselves until we either learn or grow older." Talia leaned on her staff and listened to the tiny shell sounds under the frost. "Will you always walk it?" "No," Malin said. There was no sadness in the word, only truth. No one always does. Talia knew that, yet hearing it shaped so plainly made the night feel briefly larger and quieter. Then what happens? "The same thing that happens to every worthy task," said Malin. "If it's been well loved, someone enters it halfway and keeps going." Talia turned that over for a long time. The first sign that Malin was beginning to let the root sit differently in her hands came with the lamp oil tallies. One evening at the Tidehouse, Malin passed Talia the slate and said, "Mark the date and measure. You know the hand now." Talia did. Later, Malin gave her one of the tide keys to keep until spring. Not permanently, not ceremonially, just matter-of-factly, as one might hand over a tool that had found its next proper shelf. "Don't lose it," Malin said. "I won't. If you do, the geese will hold it against you." By late winter, Talia was sometimes sent ahead from the village markers to relight the Tidehouse lamp before Malin followed with the far oil tin. On clear evenings she crossed alone as far as Lantern Rest and back, not out of romance, but because the weather and her feet had become acquainted enough to trust each other. She never took that trust lightly. Carefulness remained one of the road's first lessons, and she kept it close. And spring returned with green shoots in the marsh grass and lambing cries from the inland banks. The estuary widened again under softer winds. Reed cutters worked farther out. Sea pink brightened the shell mounds at far reach. With spring came more crossing, and with more crossing came a renewed interest from villagers who'd long considered the flats route merely an old habit of Malin's. Some spoke of reopening one of the unused salt sheds for seasonal storage. Others suggested that the chapel rain barrel be enlarged because travellers now often paused there to drink and rest. A rope merchant from upriver, seeing the steadier movement, proposed bartering tarred line for smoked mussels and shell lime. All modest things, all signs that the causeway had entered the living fabric again. One afternoon, when the tide was high and there was no walking to be done, Talia sat with Ina in the yard binding the corners of new carrying sacks. Moss toddled between them with a wooden spoon, pausing now and then to inspect an ant, or to lean thoughtfully against Talia's knee. "You were right," Talia said. Ina threaded the needle through double reed cloth. "About what?" "That belonging can gather." Ina smiled without looking up. "Did I say that?" "Not in those words." "Ah." She drew the stitch snug. "Words are only baskets. Meaning is what we carry in them." Talia sat with that. Then, because some truths are easier said while hands remain occupied, she added, "I think I used to worry that there had been a first family and then a second one, and that I was standing in the doorway between." Ina set down the sack. The yard smelled of reed, soap, and sun-warmed wood. Moss had discovered a snail shell and was showing it great seriousness. "There was grief before me," Ina said softly. "I knew that when I came. I never wished to replace what belonged to your mother, only to live kindly beside it. Families are not loaves that must be baked once or not at all. They are more like nets. They are mended, extended, knotted again." Talia looked at her hands, at the reed fibres crossing and tightening into shape. Malin said most of life is arrived at halfway. Wise woman, they worked on. After a while, Talia realised she was no longer carrying the old feeling like a pebble in her shoe. It had not vanished. It had worn smooth. In early summer, the village held a small market day beside the upper shore for traders from Reed End, Far Reach and the inland banks. Because the causeway now stood sound through ordinary tides, several loads came over it before the creek boats had even untied. There were salt cakes wrapped in wax cloth, shell-lime sacks sealed tight, bundles of sweet rush for mat weaving, smoked mussels in narrow jars, barley loaves, blue-dyed reed ribbons, eel traps, goose feathers, and small glazed pots with green rims that caught the sun beautifully. Talia walked the line at dawn with Malin to make certain the markers showed clean and the tide house bell hung free. Then they stood at the village edge and watched the first donkeys come in. The bells on their harnesses sounded soft and deliberate. Hooves tapped the shell stones. The load swayed carefully balanced. A child from Reed End rode atop 2 empty baskets and grinned as if crossing the flats were the most natural beginning to a market morning in the world. Talia felt something deep and quiet answer in her chest. Malin, beside her, said nothing for a while. At last she murmured, "There are worse ways to spend a life than keeping a path until others remember it." "No," said Talia, "there aren't many better." The old woman glanced sideways and the corners of her mouth moved. As the year turned from spring toward another summer, the rhythm of the causeway settled into the village so firmly that even those who had once doubted it now relied upon it without much comment. The far lamp was trimmed each evening in fog months. The tide house bench held resting baskets. The white markers were renewed when winter peeled them. The drain channels were cleared after storm surges. Donkeys and foot travellers used the route when creek winds were contrary or water low. Herbs came sooner. Salt stayed drier. News crossed in weather that would once have delayed it. Yet for Talia, the deepest change was not in the goods, nor even in the route itself. It was in how she moved through her own days. She no longer rushed every task as if speed could prove devotion. She had learned from Tide and Stone that timing mattered as much as effort, and from Malin that tending what one enters is a fuller kind of belonging than trying to be first in all things. When Moss cried, she did not leap from the table with frantic guilt, but finished the knot she was tying and then went with calm hands. When Ina asked for help, Talia listened all the way through the instruction rather than racing ahead and doing it twice. When her father paused over a barrel seam, she waited long enough to see what he was truly checking. These were small changes. They altered the whole shape of her. On a still evening near the end of that second summer, Malin took her once more to the far watchbox behind the chapel. The shell mounds glowed softly in the last light. Geese muttered near Maiden Pan. The new lamp burned on its bracket, steady as if it had never spent dark years gone. Malin unlocked the box with the tide key Talia now knew by weight and shape. She drew out Hesper's letter, looked at it a moment, then folded it into fresh oilcloth. "I think," she said, "it should remain here." "Good." "Yeah, but there should be another note beside it." She handed Talia a page and a charcoal pencil. "What shall I write?" "The truth," said Malin. "Useful truths age well." So Talia wrote slowly and carefully that the causeway had been restored not by one keeper, but by many hands. That the tide house roof held firm, the markers had been renewed, the far lamp rehung, the bell line restored, and the route again served those who crossed with care. That a path through uncertain ground remains a worthy thing, and that anyone who enters work already begun need not apologize for arriving halfway. if only they help keep the line clear. She hesitated, then signed her name beneath Malin's. Talia Fenn, Malin Shaw. Malin read it, nodded once and laid it beside the older letter in the box. Now, she said. Weather may think about us too. They closed the lid. The key turned with a satisfying little weight. On the walk back, the evening tide was beginning to slip into the channels. Water gleamed between the reeds and laid silver along the mud seams. The white marker poles rose one after another through the growing dusk, each catching a little light from the lantern Talia carried. Behind them Far Reach glowed softly. Ahead, the village lamps waited by the shore. At Lantern Rest, Malin paused and looked not old exactly, but long-lived, which is a different thing. The wind moved the edge of her cloak. The bell above the tide house gave one low, round note. You know, she said, I never minded that the world favoured barges for a time. Barges have their uses. I only minded the laziness of forgetting that more than one route can serve a place. Talia held the lantern steady. Do you think people will forget again? Eventually, many things are forgotten. That is why they must be noticed repeatedly. But no, not soon. Not while feet keep learning the line. They walked on. That night, from the back window, Talia watched the causeway light move outward and back, just as she had done when she was younger. Only now she recognized the pattern not as mystery but as labour, affection, memory and care braided together across the flats. The light went first toward Far Reach, then returned by the whitened markers, pausing once at the tide house, once at Needle Turn, once where the first grass met the shell stones. Behind her Ina hummed while folding cloth. Moss slept under his blanket. Her father set a barrel hoop quietly in place. The whole cottage held that ordinary lamplit peace which is among the finest endings any day can earn. From then on, whenever fog rose over the flats and the causeway bell answered from the middle distance, travellers in the village would listen with relief rather than wonder. They knew what the sound meant. A line was being kept. A passage remained. Out among the shifting edges of tide and mud, someone had taken the old path seriously enough for others to trust it again, and often now that someone was Talia. Some evenings she walked beside Malin, some evenings a little ahead, checking the white markers where gull droppings dimmed them, scraping shells from a stone lip, tightening the bell line with fingers that had learned their work. Some evenings Malin sent her on ahead with the oil tin while she stopped at the village bell locker to check the spare wick and count the weathercloths. Some evenings Malin followed later, appearing out of mist or moonlight with that same measured pace Talia had first admired from the back window, as if the causeway itself had gathered into human shape for an hour and taken up a lantern. And some evenings, when the tide was easy and the sky clear enough to show every marker from shore to Far Reach, Malin remained only at the first stone while Talia went out alone to the tide house, rang the little bell once, checked the bench and the threshold drain, and came back with her cheeks bright from wind and purpose. None of this was announced. It happened with the quietness proper to true succession. A basket shifts hands. A key changes pocket. A younger voice begins answering questions before the older one has fully turned. That is how many of the oldest village duties continue, and the causeway was old enough to prefer it so. Summer ripened and softened. The flats flashed white under noon sun, then blue under evening haze. Samphire thickened in the wetter places. The reed screens at Sea Mile dried to a warm honey colour and whispered in every breeze. On market mornings the route carried small, orderly traffic. A marshwoman with herb bundles wrapped in sailcloth, a boy from Reed End carrying willow trays stacked taller than his head, two inland sisters with jars of pear syrup cushioned in straw, an eel fisher bringing coiled traps to trade for shell lime and salt cakes. Sometimes the traders crossed by creek and returned by causeway, sometimes the reverse. No one declared the old line superior to all others, and that pleased Malin. A useful route, she said, does not need vanity. The tied house, once leaning and half sunk in neglect, developed a modest dignity. Someone left a spare broom there. Someone else repaired the peg rail. Ina sent out a little woven mat to keep the driest corner from damp when baskets were set down. The Smokehouse Twins, who in time became known to Talia as the Smokehouse Twins simply because the village gave people names by function faster than by family, hung a clay water bottle on a shaded hook inside. Jorin the potter sent a jar with a narrow neck for lamp oil, saying it would pour more cleanly than the dented tin. The old toad beneath the bench remained, regarding these improvements with an expression of ancient scepticism. At Far Reach, too, quiet change continued. One salt shed reopened, not fully, but enough to store wrapped cakes of marsh salt through dry weather. The chapel rain barrel was replaced with a broader one made from two coopered casks joined and sealed. A pair of reed racks were braced and used again for drying rush bundles. Geese kept their own opinions, as always, but even they seemed less offended by human industry, now that it moved in sensible rhythm with the place. Talia discovered that restoring a path and restoring the places along it were not separate tasks at all. A causeway with no safe bench at its midpoint discouraged old knees. A lamp without oil storage at the far end was merely hopeful decoration. A bell with no dry rope coiled nearby would fail when damp swelled the line. A shed with no hooks for hanging wet cloaks remained half a shelter. The work braided outward into details, and each detail, once noticed, seemed too practical to ignore. She loved that about it. She loved that beauty arose not from ornament but from care. The white marker poles against the blue dusk, the tied house door shutting true, the far lamp reflected in the pooled water of Maiden Pan, the dry brush marks left on the shell stones after sweeping, the smooth loop of the tide key hanging from a peg. These things were plain, but plainness does not prevent grace. Often it carries it more faithfully. One late afternoon, while Ina was cutting reed cloth for market sacks, and Moss was napping with one arm flung over his blanket in perfect trust, Talia sat on the threshold binding the corners of a net bag for shell pegs. Her father was at the workbench fitting stoppers for a pair of small oil casks meant for far-reach storage. The house held the warm smell of wood shavings, reed dust, milk warming for supper, and the far salt edge of the estuary drifting in through the back window. After a while her father said without looking up, "Malin walked with your grandfather too, you know." Talia lifted her head. He rarely offered such things unless the memory had risen whole and ready. Did she? Yes, not every night, but in bad fogs and once in the winter after the creek ice split the ferry mooring. He traded barrel staves across to the far shore then. Said Malin could smell a soft edge stone before she stepped on it. He shaved another fine curl from the stopper. "I was younger than you, and thought the whole business solemn beyond measure. Now I think it was mostly practical, which is often how important things hide." Talia smiled down at her binding cord. "Malin says the same in different words." "Of course she does." He set the fitted stopper into place and at last glanced toward her. "You move differently now." She knew what he meant. Not taller, though she had grown a little. Not older merely. Something in her pace had changed. She laughed softly. "So Mother said too, in her own fashion." "Did she?" "She said I no longer run at tusks like a gull after a crust." That made him chuckle, the sound brief and deep. "High praise." Ina, without lifting her head from the reed cloth, said, "It was measured praise. There is a difference." The whole room felt just then easy and woven. Talia looked at Ina's bent head, at the basket of cut reed lengths by her knee, at Moss asleep in the corner, at her father's careful hands, and understood again that belonging had indeed gathered. Not because someone had once declared it, because it had been practised. One evening, one knot, one returned lamp, one shared loaf at a time. Toward the end of that summer, Maylin began rising from low work more slowly. It was not illness, only age making itself politely impossible to ignore. Her knees objected after long crouching by the stone seams. Damp weather settled in her left wrist. She would rest a moment with one hand on her staff, then continue exactly as before. Talia noticed this and pretended not to notice, because attention can sometimes be kindest when it does not turn into fussing. But Maylin noticed Talia noticing. At the tide house one wind-pressed evening, after they had resecured the screen on the seaward side, she sat on the bench and accepted the cup of fennel tea Talia handed her from the little flask Ina had packed. "You're about to offer to carry the lamp every night," Maylin said. Talia sat beside her. Outside, the flats were silver under gathering dusk. "I was thinking it. Yes, you could let me. I do let you. More often." Maylin blew once over the tea before sipping it. "And if I do, will you mistake that for a farewell?" "No." "Good, because it is not." She rested the cup in her palms. An old keeper should step back the way tide steps from shore, by leaving clear ground, not by vanishing all at once. Talia turned the words slowly in her mind. "So what do? We make room carefully." This became their new pattern, fast and soul. On clear evenings, Talia took the first half of the route alone and Maylin met her at Lantern Rest. On foggy evenings they still crossed together, because some weathers ask for company. On market eves, when many loads were expected, Talia went out earlier to brush the middle stones before dusk, while Maylin checked the village bell and the spare markers. When repairs were needed at far reach, Maylin supervised from the chapel step, while Talia carried out the setting, mixing lime, testing alignments, counting the bell strokes. It was less a handing over than a widening so that the work might hold both of them properly. Autumn came again, not harshly, but with pearly mornings and longer shadows over the flats. The first sea lavender had long since gone to seed. The reeds browned. The gulls grew louder before weather. Traders began to time their crossings more carefully, and the causeway bells sounded on more evenings than not. One dusk, while the tide was still draining from Sea Mile in long shining threads, a young mother from Reed End came across carrying a child wrapped in wool against her shoulder. Behind her walked a boy, perhaps 10 years old, with a basket of dried apples and a face set in the serious concentration children often wear when they mean to be brave. They were on their way to marry the healer in the village because the little one had developed an ear fever and had not slept. Talia met them at Needle Turn with the lantern raised. "Is the road dry enough?" the woman asked quietly. "It is," Talia said. "Keep to the white poles and the brush marks. There's tea at the tide house if you need to stop." The woman looked surprised for a moment, perhaps because she had expected Maylin, and found instead a girl little older than her own son. But then her gaze dropped to the steady lantern, the clean markers, the firm line of the causeway beneath her feet, and whatever doubt she had loosened. When Talia led them in through the early fog, hearing the child's sleepy breathing and the soft crunch of dried apples shifting in the basket, she felt again that quiet certainty she had first known on the dense autumn night months before. A line was being kept. That was enough. At home later, she told Ina of the crossing while stirring fish broth above the hearth. Ina listened, then took the ladle from her. "You did well." Talia looked at the broth, at the swirl of fennel and steam. "I think so." Ina leaned a hip against the table. "You sound surprised." "A little?" "Why?" Talia thought. "Because sometimes I still imagine that being the youngest person in a task means I am pretending." Ina smiled. "Then perhaps the task will go on teaching you." It did. As the cold season gathered, the village formally arranged something that had, in practice, already begun. The clerks, after much sharpening of pens and excessive fondness for ruled columns, posted a simple notice by the bell tower. It named a small turning of responsibilities for the flats route. Malin Shaw would remain senior tide watch, keeper of the far lamp and advisor on weather and stone. Talia Fenn would serve as regular assistant on fair evenings, keeper of the middle bell and recorder of oil and marker conditions. Others were listed for storm clearing, or pole whitewashing, screen repair, and storage checks. Reading her own name in the clerk's black ink gave Talia a little shock, not of pride exactly, but of recognition. The village had placed her within the work in the ordinary way villagers place people within enduring things, by writing down what everyone already knew. Malin, when shown the notice, merely said, "The clerk always arrives after reality, but he does dress it neatly." That winter was mild by estuary standards. There were no terrible storm surges, only 2 strong tides that left wrack shoulder high at the seaward screen, and 1 week of freezing mornings when the shell stones sang under boots like thin glass. The causeway held well. The middle bell rope had to be changed once when salt damp roughened it. The far oil chest I opened with the tide key Talia now wore on a cord under her cloak, remained dry except at one corner where the wood needed pitch. The tidehouse toad disappeared for a month and then returned as if no absence had occurred. In quiet hours, Talia began making a fair copy of the route notes. Hesper's old letter remained in the far watch box, and Talia would not presume to replace it. But the practical information scattered across tally slates, remembered instructions, and Malin's remarks deserved better than to live only in weathered minds. So by lamplight, after supper, with Moss asleep and Ina sewing beside the hearth, she copied what she had learned into a narrow ledger. Which winds pushed water hardest against needle turn? How often to inspect the lower screen lashings in weed season? Where to find dry willow in a wet autumn? How much oil the far lamp used in thick fog versus clear damp? What loads ought not be trusted to see mile after the 3rd spring tide unless the western edge had been rechecked? Her handwriting improved with the importance of the task. One night her father looked over the page and whistled softly through his teeth. "You've written half the causeway into a book. Only the parts I can remember." "That is how books begin," Ina said. Talia smiled and kept writing. By spring the ledger had acquired sections: tides, lamps, marker care, shelter repairs, common goods crossing from village to far reach and from far reach inland, weather signs not to be ignored merely because one has hoped for better. Malin, shown these entries one by one, corrected them with ruthless economy. "Not after a hard southern wind," she would say. "It'll be after 2 hard southern winds if the first comes on a low neat." Or, "Do not write mud dangerous. All mud is dangerous to fools. Write where it mouths the stone after thaw." Talia altered each line gratefully. In that way, the old causeway became not only a path underfoot, but also a body of knowledge steadied into words. Talia liked this almost as much as she liked brushing the stones, because writing it felt like building another sort of marker, one that might stand when weather took wood or lime. The second summer of her keeping brought a soft prosperity to the route, though she would never have called it that aloud. The reopened salt shed at Far Reach filled steadily with wrapped cakes for inland trade. The smokehouse twins began sending small smoked fish bundles across by dawn, when the creek was wrong for boats. Raid organised a late summer herb day in which marsh women and village children gathered sea fennel, samphire, mint and black tops from the farther edges, returning by the causeway with baskets smelling green and sharp. Jorin's narrow-necked jars went out full of pickled cockles and came back holding lamp oil and quince syrup. None of it was grand. All of it was sufficient, and sufficiency, once reached honestly, gives off its own quiet light. Talia had grown used to walking with a lantern now. The weight of it settled into her arm the way a familiar tool settles into a practised hand. She knew how to tilt the flame from a crosswind without thinking. She knew the hour by the colour of the flats, the coming weather by the smell rising from the outer channel, the stage of the tide by the speech of the little runnels near Needle Turn. She still asked questions, but no longer from anxiety. Now she asked from care. One evening, while they were replacing the chalk marks on the inside wall of the tide house that showed safe basket stacking heights for damp days, Malin said, "You do not hurry your questions any more." Talia laughed. No, they arrive after observation. A fine improvement. Talia capped the chalk. I think I used to believe that if I could know everything quickly I would feel secure. And now? Now I think security is mostly repeated attention. Malin's brows lifted. Very good. Perhaps you have been listening after all. The remark, dry as shell and twice as affectionate, pleased Talia more than any lavish praise might have done. Later that season came the first evening when Malin didn't cross at all. It was a fair evening, not even foggy. The sky had that washed gold stillness that sometimes lies over the estuary before a warm night. Malin met Talia at the first marker stone with the lantern already lit and the oil tallies folded. My knees are conducting a small revolt, she said. No need to let them win publicly. You take the line tonight. Talia stood very still. The village sounds behind them were soft. A cask being rolled, someone calling geese home, moss laughing somewhere up the lane. The flats ahead lay calm and pale, every marker visible nearly to seem mile. I can, she said. Yes. Do you want me back by moonrise? I want the far lamp trimmed, the tide house checked, the bell line tested, and yourself back with the oil count. If moonrise assists, so much the better. Talia nodded. Malin handed her the main lantern. Not the smaller one for the middle route, but the broad brass and horn lamp that had long been hers. The old woman did this without ceremony, which made the gesture greater. Talia crossed alone. She felt no terror, no dramatic weight, only an intensifying of all her senses. The shellstones underfoot seemed to ring more clearly. The wind brushed the reed screens with a whisper she knew well. At the tide house she checked the bench, the water bottle, the bell knot, the threshold channel. At Needle Turn she paused to inspect the western stones where last week's high water had left a darkening seam. It was sound enough. At Far Reach she trimmed the lamp, filled the measure, noted the chapel barrel half full, and sat for one quiet minute on the low wall behind the chapel while dusk turned the flats to silver blue. In that minute she understood something so simple it almost felt shy. A task becomes yours not when you feel entirely ready, but when you do it with care and bring it home whole. She returned by moonrise. Oil tally correct, bell line tested, lantern steady. Malin was waiting by the first marker, seated on an overturned basket as if waiting were itself a type of work. When Talia approached, she held out her hand for the tally rather than for the lamp. Far lamp. Trimmed. Bell. Good line. Slight fray at the lower loop by the tide house. It will last 2 more damps. Perhaps 3. Needle turn. Dark seam on the west edge, but firm. I'd like to repack the shoulder before autumn. Rain barrel? Half full. Malin nodded after each answer, then at last rose and took the lantern. There, you have kept the line. Talia had no response equal to how those words felt, so she said only, yes. After that night, a new steadiness entered the work. Malin still crossed often, especially in fog, but no longer from necessity. Sometimes she remained near the village, and listened for the tidehouse bell to know that Talia had reached the midpoint. Sometimes she sat by the salt sheds with Var and argued amiably about whether southeastern winds smelled more of rain or more of gulls. Sometimes she mended cord or polished lantern hinges while Talia made the outward rounds. It was not retirement. Malin would have disliked such a word. It was ripening. The difference matters. Years later, those who had grown up under Talia's watch would remember Malin not as having ceased, but as having settled more deeply into the edges of the task where wisdom often belongs. She knew this stone is one thing. Hiki-san, she knew why it matters, and when to leave it untouched is another. That second knowing she gave generously. The 3rd autumn of Talia's crossing was the loveliest. The reed beds turned bronze. The dawn mists lifted slowly off the estuary and left everything pearl bright. Far Reach sent in salt cakes wrapped with blue reed ribbon. A small flourish, Ina declared completely unnecessary and therefore charming. The inland women answered with quince paste in clay jars and bundles of saffron-dyed wool thread that glowed like little hearth fires. Jorin made new lamp bases for 2 village households on the strength of his renewed trade with the marsh side. Even the clerk admitted, when cornered by Var, that the flats route had proved materially beneficial, which in Clark language was nearly lyric praise, and on one of those golden evenings Malin asked Talia to walk with her, not to the causeway first, but up to the rise behind the bell tower, where one could see the whole estuary spread below. They went near sunset. The tide was out, laying the flats bare in silver strips and pale islands. The causeway showed clearly from first marker to white steps, a delicate certain line. The tide house sat firm at its midpoint. Far Reach glowed in low light. Chapel wall amber, salt shed roof dark, new lamp bracket catching the last sun. Small figures moved there and on the village side too, people finishing ordinary work. Malin leaned on her staff. Her white kerchief had come loose at one side, and the wind played with it as it pleased. "Look," she said. Talia looked. Not at the scenery only, though it was beautiful. She looked at continuity made visible. At the line of markers, the repaired shelter, the working lamp, the crossing figures, the shore households that now expected and supported the route without needing to be persuaded each week afresh. "You kept it," Talia said quietly. Malin shook her head. "No, we kept it. That is the proper plural." They stood a while longer. The bell tower shadow lengthened over the grass. Below them someone laughed near the fish sheds. Farther out a curlew called. Then Malin added in the same even tone, "When I'm gone, do not make a shrine of my habits." Talia turned. "I mean it," Malin said. "Keep what is useful. Alter what weather or trade requires. Move a marker if the mud shifts permanently. Change the bell interval if new fog proves different. Repair the tide house roof with better reed if better reed is what you have. Memory is not the same as freezing a thing in place." Talia listened very carefully. "The route matters," Malin said, "not my vanity in it." "There is no vanity in it." "Good. then there will be none in you either. The remark was so direct that Talia laughed. Malin did too, a brief dry laugh like shell clicking together in surf. That evening they crossed together, and the whole way Talia carried the sound of those words with her. Keep what is useful. Alter what weather or trade requires. It seemed to her that the lesson belonged not only to the causeway, but to families, houses, grief, love, and nearly every enduring thing. By winter the ledger she kept had become thick enough that Ina sewed a proper cover for it from waxed cloth backed in reed fibre. Talia tied it with blue cord and stored it in the village bell locker on a high shelf beside the spare wick box, where weather and mice could not too easily reach it. On the inside cover she wrote, in her careful hand, the flats line, marks, lamps, tides, repairs, loads, and other useful things. Malin, upon seeing the title, said, "Excellent! No foolish poetry to frighten practical readers." But she touched the cover with unmistakable approval, and so the seasons went, not dramatically, not with sudden reversals or loud triumphs. The causeway simply remained in use, which for old works is often the happiest fate. Salt moved, herbs moved, lamps burned, reed screens were rewoven when needed. Children grew up hearing the Tidehouse bell and understanding its meaning without ever having lived in the years when silence nearly claimed that stretch of flats. Far Reach became no bustling port, and no one desired it to. It was enough that it breathed again within the larger life of shore and marsh. As for Talia, she became so associated with the evening line that some villagers began, half fondly and half practically, to ask one another at dusk, "Has Talia the lamp tonight?" As though the weather itself might be better answered once they knew. She still helped at home, still stitched corners, minded moss, carried oil casks for her father, sorted reeds with Ina. But the causeway had entered her bearing. She moved with more patience. She listened longer. She no longer feared that arriving halfway made her less rightful. On the contrary, she had learned that much of what deserves our love already exists before we reach it. The deeper art is to come to it gently and keep it sound. On still nights she would sometimes stand at the back window after the household slept and watch the line of the flats under moonlight. The lamp at Far Reach showed like a low star. The white markers gleamed faintly. Somewhere between them and the village the Tidehouse sat with its patched roof, its bench, its toad, its bell rope, its peg rail, and all the humble proofs of care that had gathered there. She would think of Hesper's letter in the watch-box, and of the newer note she had written beside it. She would think of Malin, of Ina's net-mending wisdom, of her father's patient stoppers and barrels, of moss growing up in a house where old and new affections no longer troubled one another. Then she would sleep. In years to come, other children would walk the causeway too, some for errands, some for work, some merely to learn the line in fair weather, so that in poor weather they would not fear it. Talia would teach them what Malin had taught her, how to place a foot on shell-set stone, how to hear hidden water, how to keep a lamp trim, how to read the white markers in fog, how to distinguish a route that only looks dry from one that truly carries. And when one of them, puzzled and earnest, asked why she still walked the same old road across the flats, she would likely smile in the lantern light and say first the shortest answer, because the shortest answer is often a good doorway. Then, if the child proved worthy of the longer one, Dad, she would give that too. For the truth was simple and endless enough to outlast many tides. She walked because the line did not keep itself by wishing. She walked because useful things deserve attention. She walked because the causeway was not only shell and stone, but relation made visible between village and marsh, shore and far salt, weather and need. She walked because she'd entered halfway and discovered that halfway is where most real belonging begins. And on calm evenings, when the estuary spread silver and blue beneath a rising moon, the village would sometimes see two lights out upon the flats. One would be steadier and lower, moving with the familiar confidence of a younger keeper in her strength. It travelled neither too quickly nor too slowly, but with the measured certainty of someone who knew that a path over uncertain ground must be honoured at the pace it asked for. That light would dip now and then where the causeway fell slightly toward the middle runnels, then rise again when it found the firmer shell-set stones. Sometimes it paused at Needle Turn, where the mud liked to mouth the edge after certain tides. Sometimes it lingered at the tide house, throwing a warm square of amber through the patched doorway, while a hand checked the bell line, the bench, the water jar, and the dry corner where travellers set down baskets. Sometimes it moved cleanly on toward Far Reach without pause at all, because the weather was gentle, the markers clear, and every part of the route content for one evening simply to be itself. The other light, when Malin still chose to cross, ears would follow or wait or pause at the first marker, amber and unhurried, content now not to bear the whole line alone. There was peace in that second lamp, and a kind of rest that had not been there in earlier years. Once it had seemed to the village that Malin's light and the causeway were nearly the same thing. So long had she carried it through fog and moonless damp, through seasons when no one else thought much of the Flats road, unless weather or need forced them to remember. But now the old woman's lamp could remain by the first stone for a while, or drift only as far as lantern rest before turning back, and the causeway would not grow dim for lack of her. That, too, was a form of mending. Work long held in one pair of hands had widened enough to settle into two, then into many, and the widening had brought its own gentleness with it. The two lights would glimmer along the pale causeway, crossing and returning between shore and Far Reach, while bells answered softly in the mist. In clear weather the bells were scarcely needed, and yet they still gave their occasional round notes, as if to reassure the air itself that all was well. In fog they mattered more. Then the tide house bell spoke from the middle distance, and the far bell, when wind allowed, gave back a fainter answer from beyond the chapel wall. Between those two notes lay the white markers, the shell stones, the patch shelter, the reed screens, the firm plinth at white steps, the smoothed shoulder of Needle Turn, and all the practical patient work by which a path through shifting ground becomes trustworthy again. But the bells did not call for attention in any grand way. They did not command. They did not startle. They simply kept company with the lights, and together they told the village what it most needed to know at day's end. The line was being walked, the route was in mind, and anyone who must cross had not been forgotten. It was a peaceful sight. People saw it from many places and gathered different comforts from it. The fishwives, rinsing boards by the last of the dusk, would glance over the salt grass and nod to themselves before carrying their baskets in. The smokehouse twins, setting their vents for the night, often paused with smoke on their sleeves and watched until at least one light had reached the tide house. The rope-makers' sons sent out to bring in a coil left too long in the yard, would stop in their squabbling long enough to count the lamps and argue in whispers over whether the lower one belonged to Talia or to Malin, though by then everyone knew the younger light by the way it moved. Old Va, who complained of many things because complaint was one of his native languages, never once complained of those lights. If anything, he seemed to grow calmer at their appearance, as if their regular passage set some old hinge of the evening in place within him. Even the clerk, who preferred ink to weather and had once doubted whether any path over mud deserved such devotion, grew used to looking toward the flats before fastening his shutters. Those who'd crossed the causeway in need felt something more particular when they saw the lamps. A mother whose child had once been carried over in fever could glance through her window at the moving amber and remember the relief of finding the white markers firm beneath her feet. A shepherd who had come by the flats in storm-swept dusk with 2 lambs bundled in a sack might see the far light and recall how warm the tidehouse bench had seemed beneath his tired knees. Murray the healer, sorting dried mint into bundles by her own hearth, would sometimes pause with a leaf still in hand and listen for the bell, not because she intended to cross, but because the sound affirmed that remedies, messages, salt, herbs, and small necessary kindnesses could still move between shore and marsh when other routes failed or delayed. The lights did not merely mark a road, they marked relation. They said that distance had not hardened into separation. They said that a village could still keep faith with the ground beyond its last garden fence. It told anyone looking that the path remained, not remained as a ghost, nor as a thin superstition spoken of by old people, but remained in the fullest and most practical sense. The stones were brushed, the channels drained, the edges were known, the bad seams were watched. The markers held their pale heads up over the flats, even when tide glazed everything silver and the marsh islands seemed to float without roots. The causeway persisted beneath those lights, as real and exact as a well-used stair in a familiar house. Children born after its restoration grew up taking that reality almost for granted, and this pleased Malin more than praise ever had. There is no finer success in such work than to have what was once nearly lost become ordinary again. To be able to say, yes, of course the path is there. Of course it is tended. Of course one may take the flats line if the creek fog thickens. That quiet of assumption is a deep reward for long labour. That the shelter stood. The tide house, once leaning into neglect with its threshold drowned in mud and its roof giving up reed by reed to the weather, now possessed an unassuming welcome that travellers trusted. Its doorway shut properly. Its bench had been planed smooth enough not to catch rough wool. The little peg rail held cloaks, baskets, and sometimes a string of damp herbs drying in the crosswind. The water jar was kept filled often enough that no one expected thirst to be their companion through the middle flats. The bell rope hung coiled when not in use, and the chalk marks on the inner wall told any careful person where loads might be rested without blocking the dry corner or knocking the lamp tin. In autumn, the shelter smelled of wet reed, shell lime, and the faint peppery scent of samphire brought in on boots. In winter, it smelled of wool, lamp oil, and cold iron. In summer, when the doorway stood open to invite a little air, it held the clean, mingled breath of brine, sun-warmed wood, and the sea fennel Talia sometimes tucked into a crack above the lintel because she liked the smell. It was not grand, yet it had become once more what all true shelters are, a place that seemed to lower the shoulders of whoever entered. That the lamp had been trimmed. In many houses far from the estuary, such a statement would have sounded too small to matter. But on the flats it mattered deeply. A badly kept lamp guttered, smoked, wasted oil, and dimmed precisely when steadiness was most needed. A well-trimmed lamp burned with a clean settled flame, neither showy nor weak, and that difference could be felt by anyone walking in weather. Talia had learned the trimming first by watching, then by practice, then by the intimate knowledge of fingers that no longer needed to think their way through the motions. She knew how much char to pinch away, How close to cut the wick in dry nights and in damp ones. How to test the oil level by weight when light was poor. How to wipe salt bloom from horn panes without scratching them. She knew the smell of a lamp about to foul before the smoke showed. She knew that if the far wind blew hard from the outer channel, the vent cap needed checking twice. And because she knew these small things, travellers walking the causeway did not have to know them. They only had to lift their eyes and find the amber glow where it ought to be. That the old road over uncertain ground was once again a trustworthy thing. There are few gifts more calming than trust restored in a useful place. The estuary remained what it had always been, shifting, tidal, beautiful, indifferent to carelessness. Mud still softened after certain rains, channel still widened and narrowed by the season. Wind still took liberties with weak lashings and unwatched doors. Yet through all that change, the causeway had become dependable without pretending to conquer the water around it. It did not deny uncertainty. It simply answered it with preparation. This is a wisdom some roads know, and some people only learn slowly. A trustworthy thing is not always the one least touched by change. Often it is the one most attentively kept in conversation with it. So the sight of those two lights carried many meanings, though no one would have listed them aloud at the end of an ordinary day. It meant the weather had been considered. It meant the oil stores were sound. It meant the tide house threshold was clear. It meant no storm rack had gone unnoted at Seam Mile. It meant the white markers had not yet peeled badly enough to confuse them with the bones of driftwood under moonlight. It meant Malin, or Talia, or both, had laid eyes on the route and judged it fit. And because human beings rest more deeply when the world around them contains such steady attentions, the village slept more easily for those lights than most of them consciously knew. And in the cottage near the upper rope walk, where reed cloth dried by the hearth and a child's shoes waited by the door, Talia slept each night in the deep, easy knowledge that she belonged not because she had stood at the beginning of the line, but because she had learned how to keep it open. This knowledge did not blaze in her. It was not the sort of realization that arrives with tears or sudden vows. It has come to her slowly, by weather and repetition, by carrying, listening, tying, trimming, waiting, watching, returning. It lived in her now the way tide knowledge lives in marsh grass or grain. Knowledge lives in a miller's wrist. When she laid aside her cloak and set the key on its peg, when she rubbed salt from her knuckles by the wash basin and ate the slice of bread Ina always saved under cloth, when she bent to tuck the blanket more firmly around Moss because one foot had worked free in sleep, she did these things without the old inward doubt that once accompanied nearly every place she stood. She was no longer wondering whether she'd arrived too late to be rooted. She had put her care where her feet were, and the roots had answered. The cottage itself seemed to know it. The borrowed marsh cloak that had once felt like entry now hung among the family garments as naturally as if it had always belonged there. The work table held side by side her father's barrel tools, Ina's reed needles, and the little knife Talia used for lamp wicks and cord. Moss, who'd been a baby at the beginning of all this and was now a boy with a tumble of questions in him, sometimes fell asleep with one of the white shell pegs in his hand because to him the flats route had always simply been part of the world. On damp evenings the ledger wrapped in waxed cloth dried by the hearth with the market sacks, and no one thought that strange. The smell of sea fennel above the lintel mingled with milk, wood smoke and reed dust until all of it became the smell of home, and Talia's sleep changed too. Once, in the years when she'd not yet understood her place, she had gone to bed with thoughts still running ahead of her, trying to prove themselves faster than morning. Now she slept with the quieter weariness of one who has done a real task and left it in decent order. If rain began in the night, she did not wake in a fretful rush, imagining every pole loosened and every lamp gone dark. She knew the lashings had been checked. She knew where the spare oil stood. She knew that if weather worsened, she and Malin would meet it by sequence, not panic. This made her rest deeper than childhood alone ever could have done, not because the world had become less uncertain, but because she had learned one honourable way of living within uncertainty. Sometimes before sleep took her fully, she would hear the faintest bell through the night air, softened by walls and distance. Sometimes only the sea's long hush. Sometimes her father turning a late stopper at the bench, or Rena folding reed cloth with that dry whisper reeds make when laid in stacks. Sometimes moss murmuring in dreams. All these sounds belong together now. The house, the family, the route, the village, the far lamp, the shelter on the flats, the old woman at the first marker, the younger keeper with the oil on her cuff and salt in the hem of her cloak. None of it had begun all at once. None of it had been hers from the first, yet all of it had been entered, tended, and woven into one life, and outside, under moon, mist, or clear dark, the causeway kept receiving and returning the small warm lights that crossed it, not as spectacle, not as legend, simply as proof of care made visible against evening, which for many old roads is the loveliest fate of all,